Sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the most unexpected blessings. Eliza Thornton stepped off the dusty train in Kansas with nothing but a wedding dress and a heart full of hope, only to discover her mail-order groom had abandoned her for another woman. Stranded without a penny or a prayer, she found herself standing in the twilight shadows of Colt Barrett's ranch office, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. Barrett was the richest cattleman in 3 counties, a widower whose heart had turned to stone after losing his beloved wife to fever 5 winters past. When this desperate young woman begged him to marry her, claiming she was utterly alone in the world, something stirred in the depths of his grieving soul. What began as a marriage of pure necessity would soon become a battle between 2 wounded hearts, his frozen by loss, hers breaking from rejection. As gossip spread through the small prairie town, and Eliza struggled to find her place in a house still haunted by another woman's memory, both would discover that sometimes love grows strongest in the most unlikely soil. But can a marriage born from desperation truly bloom into the kind of love that lasts a lifetime? The Kansas wind carried the scent of prairie grass and distant rain as Eliza Thornton clutched her carpetbag with trembling fingers, standing on the weathered platform of Dusty Crossings Depot. The train's whistle faded into the vast expanse of sky, leaving behind only the echo of her shattered dreams and the bitter taste of betrayal. 3 weeks ago, she had been Miss Eliza Thornton of Boston, daughter of a failed merchant, writing careful letters to a man named Thomas Whitman, who had promised her a life of modest comfort on the Kansas frontier. Now she was simply a woman alone, abandoned before she could even meet the man who had courted her through ink and paper. The telegram had been waiting at the depot office. Its words burned into her memory. Regret to inform. Mr. Whitman departed yesterday with Miss Sally Henderson. Union blessed this morning. Suggest return east immediately. Deputy Marshal Kane. The depot master, a weathered man with sympathetic eyes, had delivered the news as gently as possible, but kindness could not soften the blow of such complete abandonment. Eliza had counted her remaining coins twice, knowing the sum would not purchase passage back to Boston. Even if it could, what awaited her there? The boarding house where she had spent her final weeks would not welcome her return, and the seamstress position she had abandoned for the promise of marriage had surely been filled. The autumn wind seemed to whisper mockingly across the empty platform, reminding her that winter would come soon, and she had nowhere to shelter from its bite. That was when Deputy Marshal Kane had mentioned the name that would change everything. Colt Barrett, richest rancher in 3 counties, the marshal had said, adjusting his badge with a thoughtful expression. Lost his wife Sarah to the fever 5 winters back. Been like a walking ghost ever since, but he's a fair man. Might be. He'd have work for a woman willing to earn her keep. The Barrett Ranch sprawled across the horizon like a small kingdom, its boundaries marked by neat rail fences and dotted with cattle bearing the distinctive CB brand. The main house rose from the prairie with an imposing presence 2 stories. Of solid timber and stone, painted white with green shutters, surrounded by cottonwood trees that had grown tall enough to provide blessed shade. Outbuildings scattered around the property spoke of prosperity. A barn large enough to shelter 50 horses, bunkhouses for the hands, grain silos that caught the late afternoon sun like golden towers. Eliza had walked the long road from town as the day began to wane, her practical brown traveling dress growing dusty and her feet aching in boots that had been crafted for city sidewalks, not prairie paths. By the time she reached the ranch house porch, shadows were lengthening and her courage had nearly failed her 3 times. Only the knowledge that she had no other choice kept her moving forward, one measured step after another. The man who answered her knock was not what she had expected. Colt Barrett stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe and hands that spoke of years working cattle and land. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face was weathered by sun and wind into the kind of rugged handsomeness that belonged to the frontier. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath-pale blue like winter ice, and just as cold. They held no warmth, no curiosity, only the distant politeness of a man who had trained himself not to feel. Mr. Barrett? Her voice had sounded smaller than she intended, nearly lost in the evening breeze. "I am. What can I do for you, miss?" His tone was courteous, but guarded, the voice of a man who had learned to keep the world at arm's length. I was to be Mrs. Thomas Whitman. Perhaps you knew him?" She had hoped for some flicker of recognition, some connection that might warm his cold regard. Colt's expression had not changed. "Heard he married the Henderson girl yesterday. You'd be the mail-order bride, then." The bluntness of his words hit her like a physical blow, but she lifted her chin with what remained of her dignity. "I would be, yes. I find myself in rather difficult circumstances. Mr. Barrett, Deputy Marshal Kane, suggested you might have work for someone willing to earn their keep." For a long moment, he had studied her with those ice-blue eyes, taking in her travel-worn appearance, her carefully mended gloves, the way she held herself straight despite her obvious exhaustion. She wondered what he saw a woman of 24. Years neither beautiful nor plain, with auburn hair that caught the dying light and gray eyes that held more strength than her trembling hand suggested. "I have a full crew for ranch work," he had said finally. "Don't need a housekeeper. Mrs. Chun comes from town twice a week for the heavy cleaning." Eliza's heart had begun to sink, but she pressed on with desperate politeness. "I can cook, sir. I can mend and tend to household matters. I'm quite capable with accounts, having helped my father with his business ledgers. I ask for very little, just shelter, and enough to see me through until I can make other arrangements." Something in her tone, perhaps the carefully controlled desperation, had made him step back and gesture toward the interior of the house. "Come in. We'll discuss this properly." The Barrett home spoke of wealth earned through hard work rather than inherited comfort. The furnishings were well made, but practical, built to last through frontier winters and prairie storms. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by bookshelves that held both practical volumes on cattle, ranching, and leather-bound classics that suggested a man of broader interests than his cold demeanor revealed. But it was the photographs arranged on the mantelpiece that told the true story of this house. The largest frame held the image of a woman who had been beautiful in the way that frontier wives were beautiful, strong, gentle, with laugh lines. Around her dark eyes and hair the color of wheat. She wore a simple dress with lace collar, and her smile held the kind of warmth that could fill a room. Other photographs showed the same woman in various poses, standing beside Colt with her hand on his arm, both of them young and radiantly happy, holding a baby that must have been lost given the absence of children in the house. Dancing at what appeared to be a barn raising, her skirts swirling around her ankles. "My wife, Sarah," Colt had said, noticing the direction of her gaze. His voice had carried the weight of 5 years' grief, compressed into those simple words. "She was lovely." Eliza had replied softly, meaning it. "I'm sorry for your loss." He had not acknowledged her sympathy, instead moving to stand behind a massive oak desk that dominated one corner of the room. The desk was neat to the point of severity, its surface holding only an inkwell, a stack of papers weighted down with a piece of polished stone, and a small wooden box that looked as though it had been carved by loving hands. "Sit," he had commanded, not unkindly, gesturing toward a chair that faced the desk. "Tell me your circumstances, miss." "Thornton. Eliza Thornton." She had settled herself carefully, smoothing her skirts and folding her hands in her lap. "I came from Boston 3 weeks ago to marry Mr. Whitman. We had corresponded for 8 months. He promised." She had stopped, unwilling to voice the foolish hopes that had led her so far from home. "Men promise many things," Colt had said with the flat certainty of someone who had learned not to trust in promises. "What skills do you have beyond the household arts you mentioned?" "I helped my father with his dry goods business for 6 years before it failed. I can read and write, keep books, manage accounts. I've taught Sunday school children, so I'm comfortable with instruction. I can ride, though I'll admit it's been some years since I've had regular opportunity." She had paused, then added with quiet honesty, "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Barrett. I understand that frontier life demands more of a woman than city living." Colt had studied her for another long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the desk's polished surface. Outside, the sun was setting in earnest, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the very air on fire. The beauty of it took her breath away, even in her distress. "Winter comes early here," he had said finally. "A woman alone won't survive it, not without protection and provision. The town has no boarding house suitable for a lady, and the hotel, well, it's not a place where a decent woman would stay long." The implication had been clear, and Eliza had felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was trapped, and they both knew it. "I could work for passage back east," she had offered, though the words tasted like defeat. "On what?" "The cattle drives are finished for the season, and a railroad won't extend credit to someone without prospects." His voice had held no cruelty, only the hard truth of frontier economics. That was when desperation had finally overcome pride. And Eliza had found herself speaking words she had never imagined she would say. "Then perhaps, that is, if you might consider." She had stopped, breathed deeply, and tried again. "You mentioned that you lost your wife. I find myself without the husband I came to find. Perhaps we might find a solution that benefits us both." The silence that followed had stretched like a taut rope, filled with the sound of the evening wind and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Colt Barrett had gone very still, his ice-blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "You're suggesting marriage," he had said, his voice carefully neutral. "A marriage of convenience, yes," she had replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. "I would not, that is, I understand such arrangements are sometimes made on the frontier. I would ask only for protection, provision, and perhaps in time, companionship. I would not presume to expect affection or intimate relations." The words had cost her every ounce of courage she possessed, but she had forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. She was gambling everything on the hope that a man who had once loved deeply might remember what it felt like to need another human being. Colt had risen from his chair and moved to stand at the window that looked out over his domain, his hands clasped behind his back. In the fading light, his profile had been sharp as a knife blade, carved from the same hard stone as the prairie itself. "I loved my wife," he had said quietly. "I will not dishonor her memory by pretending to love another." "I would not ask you to," Eliza had replied. "But perhaps two people who have both known loss might find comfort in each other's company, without expecting more than either can give." He had turned then, studying her with those pale eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "You would be mistress of this house, with all the respect that position commands. You would want for nothing in terms of material comfort. But I will not share a bed with you, Miss Thornton, nor will I pretend to feelings I do not possess. If that arrangement suits you, we can be wed before sunset tomorrow." The practical coldness of his offer had been both painful and reassuring. At least she would know where she stood. "That arrangement would suit me very well, Mr. Barrett," she had said, extending her hand to seal their bargain. "Thank you." His handshake had been firm and brief, his skin work-roughened but warm. For just a moment, she had wondered what those hands might feel like if they ever learned to be gentle again. Then he had released her and stepped back. The distance between them once again measured in more than mere feet. "I'll have Mrs. Chun prepare the guest room for you tonight," he had said. "Tomorrow we'll see the preacher and make this arrangement legal and proper." As Eliza had been shown to her temporary quarters, a neat, comfortable room with a view of the endless prairie, she had found herself staring at her reflection in the washstand mirror. The face that looked back was older than the hopeful girl who had boarded the train in Boston, marked by disappointment and determination in equal measure. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Colt Barrett, wife to a man whose heart had been buried with his first love. But she would also become mistress of the finest ranch in 3 counties, protected from the harsh realities of frontier life, and granted the respect that came with the Barrett name. It was not the love match she had dreamed of, but it was survival, and perhaps, if she was very careful and very patient, it might someday become something more. Outside her window, the prairie night had settled over the land like a vast blanket, studded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere in the house, Colt Barrett was preparing for sleep in rooms that still held the ghost of his beloved Sarah. Tomorrow, they would make their practical bargain official, and Eliza would begin the delicate work of building a life with a man whose heart remained locked away like treasure in a strongbox. She did not yet know that the key to that strongbox lay not in forcing a lock, but in proving herself worthy of the trust required to open it willingly. That lesson would come later, through small acts of kindness and the patient demonstration that some promises, once made, were never broken. The simple gold wedding band caught the late afternoon sunlight as Reverend Matthews slipped it onto Eliza's finger, his voice carrying the familiar cadences of matrimony across the small gathering assembled in the church parlor. The ring was newly purchased, hastily selected from the modest offerings at Jameson's general store, and bore none of the history or sentiment that should accompany such a symbol. Yet as Colt's calloused fingers briefly touched hers during the exchange, Eliza felt the weight of its significance settle around her like a mantle she was not certain she was ready to wear. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Kansas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Matthews declared, his kind eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a man who believed every marriage was a victory against the loneliness of frontier life. Mr. Barrett, you may kiss your bride. The moment stretched like a held breath. Colt's ice-blue eyes met hers with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply resigned to the necessities of their arrangement. His kiss was brief and formal, a mere brush of lips that fulfilled the ceremony's requirements without promising anything beyond legal obligation. When he stepped back, Eliza touched her fingers to her mouth, surprised by the gentleness of the gesture, despite its emotional emptiness. "Congratulations, Mrs. Barrett," he said quietly, and she felt a strange flutter at hearing her new name spoken aloud for the first time. The small crowd of witnesses, Deputy Marshal Kane, Mrs. Chun, the preacher's wife, and several townspeople who had gathered out of curiosity offered their good wishes with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some, like Mrs. Chun, smiled with genuine warmth, pleased to see their employer's household gaining a feminine presence. Others exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of gossip already brewing around the hastily arranged union. "Mighty quick courtship," muttered old Pete Jameson, the storekeeper, his voice carrying just loud enough to be overheard. "Man doesn't usually take a wife he met yesterday." "Mind your own affairs, Pete," Deputy Kane replied firmly. "Mr. Barrett's a grown man who can make his own choices about matrimony." But Eliza heard the whispers that followed them as they walked back toward the waiting wagon. The town of Dusty Crossings was small enough that every marriage was public business, and this one would provide entertainment for months to come. She held her head high, drawing on years of practice in maintaining dignity when her father's business failures had made her family the subject of similar speculation in Boston. The ride back to the ranch passed in companionable silence. Colt handled the horses with the easy competence of a man born to the saddle, his attention focused on the rutted road ahead. Eliza studied the landscape that was now her home, noting the way the evening light turned the grass to gold and the distant mountains to purple shadows. The vastness of the sky still took her breath away, so different from the hemmed-in streets of her former life. "The hands will be returning from the south pasture soon," Colt said as they approached the ranch house. "I'll introduce you properly. At supper, most of them are good men, but they'll be curious about the new arrangement." "Of course they will," Eliza replied. "I hope I can prove myself worthy of their respect." He glanced at her sideways, perhaps surprised by her practical acceptance of the situation. "Respect is earned here, not given freely. But you'll have my backing, which counts for something." The ranch house looked different somehow as they pulled up to the front porch. Perhaps it was simply that she was seeing it now as her home rather than as a place of refuge. But the white painted walls and green shutters seemed to welcome her with a warmth that had been absent the evening before. Mrs. Chun appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron and beaming with satisfaction. "Welcome home, Mrs. Barrett," she called, and Eliza felt a rush of gratitude for the woman's kindness. At least someone seemed genuinely pleased by the day's events. That first evening, as Mrs. Colt Barrett passed in a series of careful formalities, Colt showed her through the house with the thoroughness of a man conducting a business transaction, pointing out the locations of linens, explaining the household. Routines, introducing her to the practical details of managing a ranch home. The bedroom he had prepared for her was at the opposite end of the hall from his own chambers, a spacious room with a view of the garden and enough distance to preserve the proprieties of their arrangement. Sarah's things are still in the master bedroom, he said without inflection, standing in the doorway of what was now Eliza's domain. I haven't disturbed anything there. I understand, she replied gently. There's no need to change anything on my account. Something in his expression shifted slightly, a barely perceptible relaxation of the muscles around his eyes. I appreciate that, Mrs. Barrett. The formal address felt strange between a husband and wife, but Eliza recognized it as another of the boundaries that protected his wounded heart. She could be patient with such barriers, knowing that walls built of grief were not easily dismantled. Supper with the ranch hands proved to be the first real test of her new position. 6 men gathered around the long table in the kitchen, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their manner respectfully curious as Colt made the introductions. There was Tom Hendricks, the foreman, a grizzled man in his 50s, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Young Billy Mason, barely 18 and still growing into his height. The Rodriguez brothers, Miguel and Carlos, whose easy smiles suggested they found the situation more amusing than scandalous. Jake Sullivan, a quiet man who nodded politely but reserved judgment. And old Pete, not the storekeeper, but Pete Kowalski, whose white beard and gentle manner had earned him the role of ranch philosopher. Boys, Colt said as he took his place at the head of the table, I'd like you to meet my wife, Mrs. Barrett. She'll be managing the household from now on. The chorus of pleased to meet you, Mom, was polite if somewhat restrained. Eliza served the meal misses. Chon had prepared beef stew with fresh bread and green beans from the kitchen garden, and listened to the conversation flow around the table. The men discussed cattle prices, weather prospects, and the need to repair fencing in the north pasture, their voices creating a comfortable backdrop of daily life. Ma'am, old Pete said during a lull in the conversation, if you don't mind my asking, where did you folks meet? Ain't often the boss ventures far from the ranch these days. The question hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamps, and Eliza felt every eye at the table turned toward her. She could have deflected with vague pleasantries, but something in the old cowboy's kind face suggested he was offering her a chance to establish her place in the ranch hierarchy. We met yesterday, actually, she said calmly, cutting a piece of bread with steady hands. I came to Kansas to marry another man who had a change of heart. Mr. Barrett was kind enough to offer me an alternative arrangement. The honesty of her response seemed to surprise them. Billy Mason nearly choked on his stew, while Tom Hendricks stroked his mustache thoughtfully. It was Miguel Rodriguez who broke the tension with a low chuckle. Well, that's frontier honesty for you, he said, raising his coffee cup in a small salute. Takes courage to speak plain, Mrs. Barrett. I respect that. Indeed it does, Colt said, quietly, and Eliza caught the faint note of approval in his voice. Mrs. Barrett understands that we value straight dealing here. The rest of the meal passed more easily, with the men gradually including her in their conversation. She learned that the ranch ran nearly 3,000 head of cattle, at water. Rights were a constant concern, and that the railroad's expansion had both helped and complicated their business. By the time the hands dispersed to their evening duties, she felt she had passed some invisible test. You handled that well, Colt observed as they cleared the table together. The men need to know where they stand with you. I've learned that. Honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, usually serves better than pretense, Eliza replied, stacking plates with practiced efficiency. Your men seem like good people. I hope to earn their trust in time. Trust isn't given lightly here, he said, echoing his earlier words, but you've made a good start. That night, as Eliza prepared for bed in her new room, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been a desperate woman with nowhere to turn. Now she was Mrs. Colt Barrett, mistress of one of the finest ranches in Kansas, with a gold band on her finger and a roof over her head that no one could take away. The wedding ring caught the lamplight as she turned it on her finger, still unaccustomed to its presence. It was a symbol of practicality rather than passion, of mutual benefit rather than romantic love. Yet as she settled into the comfortable bed with its clean sheets and warm quilts, she found herself thinking that perhaps such foundations were not the worst beginning for a marriage. Through the window, she could see the light still burning in Colt's study, where he worked late into the night on ranch business. The distance between their rooms felt both appropriate and lonely, a physical manifestation of the careful boundaries they had established. But boundaries, she reminded herself, were not necessarily permanent. Given time and patience, even the most formidable walls could sometimes be gently dismantled, stone by stone. The prairie wind whispered against the windows, carrying the scents of grass and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed softly and horses shifted in their stalls. These were the sounds of her new life, as foreign and yet as comforting as the weight of the ring on her finger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. To prove herself worthy of the trust that had been provisionally extended, she fell asleep holding the simple gold band between her fingers, symbol of a marriage that had begun in desperation, but might, with care and wisdom, grow into something neither of them had dared to hope for. The worn kitchen apron hung on a wooden peg beside the stove, its faded blue fabric soft from years of washing and use. Eliza discovered it on her third morning as Mrs. Barrett, tucked behind a collection of potholders and dish towels as if someone had tried to hide it away. The careful stitching around the edges and the delicate embroidered wildflowers along. The bottom hem spoke of loving hands and patient hours spent in beautification of the practical. That was Sarah's, Mrs. Chun said quietly, appearing at Eliza's shoulder as she examined the garment. She wore it every day, that one. Said cooking was like painting. You needed something to catch the spills and keep the beauty underneath clean. Eliza's fingers traced the embroidered flowers with reverence, understanding that she held more than mere fabric. This apron was a piece of Sarah Barrett's daily life, imbued with the memory of countless meals prepared with love, of flower-dusted mornings and herb-scented afternoons. To wear it felt presumptuous, yet to leave it hanging unused seemed equally wrong. "Should I, do you think Mr. Barrett would mind if I used it?" she asked, uncertain of the boundaries around such intimate reminders. Mrs. Chun studied her with eyes that had seen the ebb and flow of frontier life for 60 years. Sarah Barrett was a practical woman, she said finally. She'd have no patience for pretty things going to waste while there's work to be done. You wear it, Mrs. Barrett. Put it to the use it was made for. And so Eliza tied the apron around her waist and began the delicate work of establishing herself in a household that still belonged, in many ways, to a woman 5 years dead. Every room held traces of Sarah's presence, embroidered cushions on the parlor chairs, books marked with scraps of fabric where she had left off reading, a half-finished piece of needlework folded neatly in a basket beside the window seat. Rather than disturbing these remnants, Eliza learned to work around them, adding her own touches with careful respect for what had come before. The ranch hands, she discovered, were watching her with the careful attention of men who had loved their previous mistress and were not prepared to transfer their loyalty easily. Tom Hendricks, the foreman, tested her with small challenges, asking her opinion on meal planning for the crew, inquiring whether she thought the bunkhouse needed additional blankets before winter set in. His questions were courteous but probing, designed to measure her practical knowledge and her willingness to involve herself in the real work of ranch life. "We'll be bringing the cattle down from the high pastures next week," he told her one afternoon as she hung laundry on the line behind the house. "Means 20 extra men for meals, maybe more if the weather turns. Mrs. Sarah used to cook for roundup crews sometimes when we were short-handed." The challenge was implicit but clear. Could the new Mrs. Barrett handle the demands of feeding a working crew, or would she prove to be merely ornamental, useful only for managing a quiet household? Eliza considered the logistics involved, calculating quantities, planning menus. That could be prepared efficiently for large numbers, ensuring adequate supplies of staples like flour and coffee. "I'll speak with Mrs. Chun about hiring additional help from town," she said, continuing to pin wet sheets to the line with steady movements. "And I'll need to know dietary preferences or restrictions among the men. Some cowboys won't eat beans 2 days running. Others won't touch vegetables if they can help it." Tom's weathered face creased into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You've cooked for crews before, Mom?" "I helped my father cater business dinners in Boston," she replied. "Different setting, same principles. Men who work hard need food that satisfies, served on time and without fuss." "Yes, ma'am," Tom said, and his tone held a note of grudging respect. "I'll get you that information." It was a small victory, but Eliza recognized its importance. The ranch hands were the backbone of the operation, and their acceptance of her authority would determine whether she could truly function as mistress of the Barrett Ranch or remain merely a guest in her own home. The evenings presented their own challenges. Colt maintained his routine of working late in his study, poring over account books and correspondence by lamplight, while Eliza occupied herself with mending, reading, or the dozen small tasks that kept the household running smoothly. They shared supper each night, their conversation polite and practical, focused on ranch business and household management. He asked her opinion on matters of domestic economy and listened thoughtfully to her suggestions, but he never lingered after the meal was finished or invited her to join him in the parlor for evening companionship. The distance he maintained was both protective and painful. Eliza understood the necessity of it. He was guarding his heart against the possibility of caring for another woman who might be taken from him, but she found herself longing for the kind of easy partnership she had imagined when she first conceived of marriage. Not romance necessarily, but the comfortable intimacy of two people who had chosen to share their lives. She began to understand the true dimensions of his grief one evening when she was returning a mended shirt to his bedroom and glimpsed the interior of the master chamber. Sarah's personal effects remained exactly as she had left them. Hairbrush and hand mirror on the dressing table, a novel bookmarked and waiting on the knitstand, slippers placed neatly beside the bed as if their owner had simply stepped out for a moment and would return soon. The sight stopped her in the doorway, moved by the poignant evidence of a love so deep that 5 years had not diminished its hold. Colt slept each night surrounded by reminders of his lost wife, choosing to preserve her presence rather than move forward into a life without her. How could any new relationship compete with such devotion to memory? "She died in that bed," Colt said quietly from behind her, his voice devoid of emotion. "Fever took her over 3 days. I sat beside her the whole time, watching her slip away and knowing there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it." Eliza turned to face him, seeing the pain he usually kept so carefully hidden. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You live here now," he replied. "You have a right to know what you've married into." He paused, studying her face in the dim hallway light. "Most women would insist I clear away her belongings, make the room properly ours." "I'm not most women," Eliza said gently. "And this isn't that kind of marriage. Your memories belong to you, Mr. Barrett. I have no right to disturb them." Something shifted in his expression, a fractional softening around the eyes that suggested. Her response had surprised him. "Thank you," he said, and she heard genuine gratitude in the words. It was a moment of understanding between them, fragile as spun glass, but real nonetheless. They were two wounded people who had agreed to share shelter while keeping their deepest hurts carefully protected. Perhaps that was enough foundation to build on, even if neither of them could yet envision what such a structure might eventually become. The days settled into a rhythm of shared work and careful distance. Eliza rose early to prepare breakfast, spending her mornings in the kitchen that was gradually becoming familiar territory. She learned which pots Colt preferred for coffee, discovered that he liked his eggs cooked firm and his bacon crispy, noticed that he always saved the best biscuits for the ranch hands rather than keeping them for himself. These small observations felt like pieces of a puzzle she was assembling without knowing what the final picture would reveal. Mrs. Chun proved to be an invaluable ally, sharing not only practical knowledge about household management, but also stories that helped Eliza understand the community she had joined. She learned that Sarah Barrett had been beloved not only by her husband, but by the entire territory, known for her kindness to struggling families and her skill at nursing the sick. She had lost 2 babies in infancy, tragedies that had only strengthened her marriage rather than straining it, drawing her and Colt into an even deeper union of mutual comfort and shared sorrow. She had a way of making people feel seen, Mrs. Chun said one afternoon as they worked together to preserve the last of the summer vegetables. Not just looked at, but truly seen for who they were underneath all the rough edges and hard times. Mr. Barrett, he was different with her. Laughed more, worried less. Since she passed, it's like he's been living in black and white when he used to see in colors. The description painted a picture of the man Colt had been before grief transformed him into the careful, controlled person Eliza had married. She found herself wondering if traces of that earlier warmth still existed beneath the protective ice, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge again. Not for her sake, necessarily. She had no illusions about replacing Sarah in his affections, but for his own healing. As her first week as Mrs. Barrett drew to a close, Eliza began to feel cautiously optimistic about her new life. The work was demanding but satisfying. The ranch hands were warming to her presence, and Colt treated her with courtesy and growing respect. It was not the partnership of equals she had once dreamed of, but it was stable and honorable, built on mutual benefit rather than mutual dependence. The apron had become her daily uniform, its familiar weight around her waist serving as both practical protection and symbolic connection to the woman who had worn it before her. Sometimes, as she worked in the kitchen or tended to household tasks, she imagined Sarah's approval of the care being taken with her home. It was a fanciful notion, perhaps, but one that brought comfort during the lonelier moments of adjustment. She was learning to be patient with the gradual process of belonging, understanding that trust and acceptance could not be rushed any more than crops could be forced to grow before their season. Like the hardy prairie grass that bent before fierce winds but never broke, she would need to develop the kind of resilient flexibility that allowed her to weather the inevitable storms while maintaining her essential self. The simple gold wedding band had already begun to feel natural on her finger, no longer a foreign presence, but part of her daily reality. It was a small thing, but symbols mattered in building a new identity. She was Mrs. Colt Barrett now, mistress of a prosperous ranch and partner in a practical alliance that might, with time and wisdom, become something more meaningful than either of them had dared to hope. The hand-carved wooden cross lay nestled between the pages of Sarah's well-worn Bible, its smooth surface polished by years of faithful handling. Eliza discovered it quite by accident while dusting the bookshelf in the LI parlor, when the leather-bound volume fell open to reveal the simple but beautiful piece of craftsmanship. The cross was no larger than her palm, carved from what appeared to be cherry wood, with delicate vine patterns etched along its arms, and a small heart carved at the intersection. She held it carefully, recognizing the intimate nature of such a personal religious artifact. The Bible itself showed signs of devoted use, margins filled with penciled notes in a feminine hand, passages underlined with careful strokes, dried flowers pressed between pages like markers of significant moments. This had been Sarah's source of comfort and guidance, her refuge during times of trial and celebration alike. She carved that herself, Colt said from the doorway, his voice carrying the familiar distance he maintained when speaking of his late wife. Spent most of one winter working on it, said keeping her hands busy helped her think through difficult passages. Eliza looked up from the cross, noting the way his pale eyes fixed on the carved piece, as if seeing not just wood and craftsmanship, but memories too precious to share. "It's beautiful work," she said softly. She was quite skilled. Sarah could turn her hand to most anything, he replied, stepping into the room, but maintaining his careful distance. Cooking, sewing, carpentry when needed. Said idle hands were the devil's workshop, so she kept hers moving from dawn to dusk. The admiration in his voice was unmistakable, tinged with the kind of loss that time had not diminished. Eliza carefully placed the cross back between the Bible's pages, understanding that she had glimpsed something sacred to his memory. Yet his willingness to speak of Sarah, however briefly, felt like a small step toward trust. "I hope someday to be half so capable," she said, closing the book gently and returning it to its place on the shelf. "You're doing well enough," Colt said, and the simple words carried more weight than elaborate praise. Coming from a man who measured worth in practical accomplishments rather than flowery compliments, such acknowledgment felt like genuine recognition. The moment was interrupted by urgent shouting from the yard outside. Through the parlor window, Eliza could see young Billy Mason running toward the house, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Colt was already moving toward the door before the boy reached the porch. "Mr. Barrett," Billy called, stumbling up the steps. "It's Jake Sullivan." "Sir?" "His horse threw him down by Willow Creek. Miguel thinks his leg might be broken, and he's bleeding something fierce from a cut on his head." Without hesitation, Colt was reaching for his hat and coat. "Have Tom saddle my horse and get the wagon." "Ready," he ordered. "We'll need blankets and something to use as a stretcher." "I'll gather medical supplies," Eliza said, already moving toward the kitchen, where she had seen Mrs. Chun keep a collection of remedies and bandages. Her father's business had occasionally required her to tend minor injuries among his workers, and frontier life demanded that everyone possess at least basic nursing skills. "You don't need to," Colt began, but she was already pulling supplies from the medical kit Mrs. Chun maintained in the kitchen pantry. "Clean bandages, carbolic acid. For antiseptic, laudanum for pain," she said efficiently, stuffing items into a canvas bag. "If his leg is truly broken, we'll need splinting materials and something to help with shock." She grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the shelf and added it to her collection. "This will do for both purposes if needed." Colt studied her with surprise, perhaps reassessing his new wife's capabilities. "You've done this before." "Enough to know that serious injuries require immediate attention," she replied, tying her bonnet securely and reaching for her shawl. "I'm coming with you." "It's not necessary. It's not about necessity," she interrupted gently but firmly. "Jake Sullivan is part of this ranch family now, which makes him my concern as well as yours. I may be useful, and I certainly won't be in the way." For a moment she thought he might argue, but practicality won over protective instincts. "Very well, but you'll follow my lead and Tom's. They know ranch injuries better than either of us." The ride to Willow Creek tested both Eliza's horsemanship and her nerve. She had not ridden regularly since her youth, but the gentle Mare Colt provided seemed to sense her uncertainty and maintained a steady, careful pace despite the urgency of their mission. The landscape flashed by in a blur of autumn colors, golden grass and scarlet sumac, cottonwoods beginning to shed their leaves in the crisp October air. They found Jake Sullivan propped against a fallen log beside the creek, his face pale with pain and his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Miguel Rodriguez knelt beside him, using his own shirt to staunch the bleeding from a nasty gash above Jake's right temple. The injured man was conscious, but clearly fighting shock, his breathing shallow and his skin clammy despite the cool afternoon air. "How did it happen?" Colt asked Tom Hendricks, who was examining the horse that had caused the accident. "Snake spooked the mare," Tom replied grimly. "Jake couldn't get her under control before she reared and threw him against that boulder there. Lucky he wasn't killed outright." Eliza knelt beside Miguel, quickly assessing Jake's injuries with the calm efficiency her father had taught her to maintain in crisis situations. The head wound was messy, but not life-threatening. The broken leg was more serious, but showed no signs of bone piercing the skin. Most concerning was Jake's increasing pallor and the way his pupils were responding sluggishly to light. "Jake," she said clearly, taking his hand in hers. "Can you hear me? I need you to stay awake and talk to M.E. Mars, Mrs. Barrett?" Jake's voice was weak but recognizable. Didn't think you'd come." "Of course I came," she replied, beginning to clean the head wound with practiced movements. "We're family here, aren't we?" "Family takes care of family." She worked steadily while the men prepared a makeshift stretcher from fence rails and blankets, cleaning and bandaging Jake's injuries while keeping him conscious through gentle conversation. Her hands remained steady despite her awareness that this was her first real test as the ranch's mistress, not just of her medical skills, but of her commitment to the people who worked the land alongside her husband. "That's good work," Tom Hendricks said quietly as they prepared to move Jake to the wagon. "Clean bandaging, proper antiseptic technique. You've had training." "Some," she replied modestly. "Enough to help until we can get him to a real doctor." The careful transport back to the ranch house took nearly an hour, with Eliza riding in the wagon bed beside Jake to monitor his condition. She administered small sips of laudanum when his pain became too intense and kept him talking to prevent him from slipping into unconsciousness. By the time they arrived home, she felt confident that while his injuries were serious, they were not life-threatening if properly cared for. Dr. Harrison arrived from town just as they were settling Jake in the spare room off the kitchen. The elderly physician examined Eliza's field treatment with professional thoroughness, nodding approvingly at her bandaging technique and the measures she had taken to prevent shock. "Fine work, Mrs. Barrett," he said as he set Jake's broken leg. "With Tom's assistance, you may have saved this young man's life by keeping him stable during transport. Have you considered nursing as a profession?" "I've had some experience with medical care," she replied, holding Jake's hand while the doctor worked. "Nothing formal, but frontier life requires everyone to know something about tending injuries." That evening, as Jake rested comfortably under her watchful care, Eliza found herself thinking about the day's events and what they had revealed about her place in the ranch community. The men's ready acceptance of her help, their trust in her judgment during a crisis, and their obvious gratitude for her skill had demonstrated something that weeks of careful domestic management could not. She was capable of being genuinely useful in ways that mattered to their shared life. Colt appeared in the kitchen doorway as she was preparing a light supper for Jake, his expression thoughtful. "Dr. Harrison says Jake should make a full recovery, thanks in large part to your quick thinking and steady hands." "I'm glad I could help," she replied, testing the temperature of the broth she had prepared. "How are the other men taking it?" "They're impressed," he said simply. "Tom hasn't stopped talking about how calm you were, how you knew exactly what to do without being told. Says it reminds him of—" He stopped abruptly, but Eliza understood the comparison he had been about to make. Sarah, too, had been capable. In crisis, willing to roll up her sleeves and tend to whatever emergency arose. Rather than feeling diminished by the comparison, Eliza found herself honored to be measured against such a standard. "She would have done the same thing," Eliza said quietly. "Any decent person would have." "Not everyone has the stomach for blood and broken bones," Colt replied. "And not everyone would have thought to come along without being asked. The men appreciate that you consider them worth your personal attention." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake's voice called weakly from the spare room. Eliza hurried to his side, finding him awake and clear-eyed for the first time since the accident. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, struggling to sit up straighter, "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did today. Miguel told me you probably saved my life." "Nonsense," she replied, helping him adjust his pillows. "You're a strong young man with good healing ahead of you. I simply provided a little assistance along the way." "It was more than a little," Jake insisted. "And I want you to know, well, some of us weren't sure what to make of this new arrangement when the boss first brought you home. But today showed us what kind of person you really are. We're glad to have you here, Mom. Real glad." The simple words touched her more deeply than elaborate speeches might have done. This was acceptance earned through action, rather than given out of politeness, recognition of her value as a person rather than merely as Colt's wife. As she settled Jake for the night and dimmed the lamp, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few short weeks. She had come to Kansas seeking security through marriage to a stranger, willing to accept a loveless union in exchange for protection and provision. What she had found instead was the possibility of something richer, a place where her skills mattered, where her care was valued, where she could contribute meaningfully to a community of good people working toward common goals. The wooden cross she had discovered that morning seemed to symbolize something important about faith and perseverance, about finding strength to endure hardship and hope through difficult seasons. Perhaps that was what she was learning here on the Kansas prairie, not just how to manage a household or navigate a practical marriage, but how to build something lasting from the raw materials of necessity and mutual respect. Outside her window, the autumn wind carried the sense of approaching winter, reminding her that harder seasons lay ahead. But inside the Barrett ranch house, warmth and purpose had begun to take root, growing slowly but surely like prairie grass, establishing itself in fertile soil. Time would tell what kind of harvest such careful tending might eventually yield. The faded blue ribbon lay, carefully preserved between layers of tissue paper in Sarah's jewelry box, its silk surface still lustrous despite the years. Eliza discovered it while organizing the late Mrs. Barrett's personal effects at Colt's request, part of his gradual effort to make the house feel less like a shrine and more like a home where life could continue. The ribbon bore a small card, tied with thread, first prize, apple pie, Sedgwick County Fair, 1878. Eliza held the simple award with reverence, imagining the pride Sarah must have felt at this recognition of her domestic skills. The county fair represented community, celebration, and the kind of normal life that seemed impossibly distant from Eliza's current circumstances. Yet as she studied the ribbon, she found herself wondering if such simple pleasures might someday return to the Barrett Ranch, if laughter and competition and shared joy could again find place alongside the serious business of survival. "She won that 3 years running," Colt said from the bedroom doorway, his voice carrying an unusual warmth. "Used to say the secret was adding a touch of cinnamon to the crust itself, not just the filling. Judges never could figure out what made her pies different from all the others." This was the longest speech about Sarah he had made in Eliza's presence, and she treasured the trust it represented. "You must miss those times," she said gently, replacing the ribbon in its careful wrapping. "The whole territory came alive during Fair Week," he continued, seeming not to hear her comment. "Horse races, livestock competitions, dancing until dawn. Sarah loved every minute of it, the bustle, the visiting, the chance to show off her handiwork." His expression grew distant. "We haven't attended since she passed. Didn't seem right." Somehow, the admission revealed more than perhaps he intended. For 5 years, Colt had avoided not just the fair, but any community gathering that might remind him of happier times. He had isolated himself so completely that the ranch had become both fortress and prison, protecting him from painful memories while cutting him off from the healing that human connection might provide. "The fair is next month, isn't it?" Eliza asked carefully, having heard the ranch hands discussing the upcoming event. Mrs. Chun mentioned that the Rodriguez brothers always enter their horses in the competitions. "November 2nd through 4th, Colt confirmed, his tone growing cautious as if he sensed where her thoughts were leading. "But we won't be attending. Too much work here with winter preparations." Eliza recognized the excuse for what it was, a defensive barrier against experiences that might threaten his carefully maintained emotional distance. Yet she also heard something else in his voice, a faint note of longing quickly suppressed but unmistakably present. Perhaps some part of him missed the community celebrations as much as he missed his wife. "Of course," she said simply, not pushing the matter. "I was merely curious about local customs." The conversation might have ended there, but fate intervened. In the form of Tom Hendricks arriving with news that would test both Colt's isolation and Eliza's growing confidence in her role as ranch mistress. "Boss," Tom called from the front porch, his voice carrying unusual urgency, "we've got a problem with the cattle drive. Johnson's outfit is 3 days behind schedule, and they're asking if we can provide temporary grazing for about 200 head while they wait out this weather system." Colt was immediately focused on business, the personal conversation forgotten as he moved into his role as rancher and businessman. "How long are we talking about?" "Maybe a week, possibly 2 if this cold snap brings early snow," Tom replied. "They're willing to pay premium rates for the feed, and it would put us in good standing with one of the biggest operations in the territory." "Where would we put them?" Colt asked, already calculating logistics. "The north pasture is still being prepared for winter, and the south grazing is spoken for." "That's the thing, boss," Tom said with obvious reluctance. "Best option would be the east meadow, but that borders the Hutchinson property. You know how old Silas feels about increased traffic near his land." The mention of their neighbor brought a frown to Colt's face. Silas Hutchinson was a cantankerous widower who had been feuding with various neighbors for decades, always convinced that someone was trying to cheat him or encroach on his property rights. Any business arrangement that might disturb his peace would require delicate negotiation. "I'll ride over and speak with him," Colt said with obvious reluctance. "See if we can reach some accommodation." "Actually," Eliza said quietly, Perhaps I might be of assistance with that conversation. Both men turned to stare at her with surprise. The idea of sending the new wife to negotiate with the territory's most difficult neighbor was so unexpected that Tom actually removed his hat and scratched his head in bewilderment. "Mrs. Barrett," Colt said carefully, "Silas Hutchinson is not an easy man to deal with. He's been known to run visitors off his property with a shotgun, which is precisely why a woman's approach might succeed where a man's has failed," Eliza replied calmly. "From what I understand, Mr. Hutchinson is a widower who has been living alone for many years. He may respond better to courtesy and domestic consideration than to business propositions." Tom Hendricks looked skeptical. "Ma'am, with all due respect, old Silas hasn't spoken a civil word to anyone in this territory for the better part of a decade. What makes you think he'll listen to you?" "Because I'm not asking him to give up anything or admit he's been wrong about anything," Eliza explained. "I'm simply one neighbor asking another for temporary accommodation, woman to man, with the understanding that such favors are the foundation of community survival." Colt studied her with the intense attention he usually reserved for evaluating livestock or weather patterns. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Let me visit him this afternoon with some fresh bread and perhaps a jar of the apple preserves Mrs. Chun put up last week," she said. "I'll approach this as a social call rather than a business negotiation. Sometimes the indirect path leads more surely to the desired destination." "And if he refuses to see you? Or worse, if he takes offense at the intrusion?" Colt's protective instincts were clearly warring with his recognition that conventional approaches had failed with their difficult neighbor. "Then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Eliza replied pragmatically. "But if I can establish some measure of goodwill, it might open possibilities for future cooperation as well as solving our immediate problem." The logic was sound, even if the execution would be risky. After several minutes of discussion, during which Tom raised every possible objection, and Colt weighed the potential benefits against the possible disasters, they agreed to let Eliza attempt her diplomatic mission that afternoon, wearing her most respectable dress and carrying a basket laden with fresh-baked bread, apple preserves, and a small cake decorated with late-season flowers from the kitchen garden. Eliza rode the gentle mare toward the Hutchinson property. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the landscape had taken on the golden-brown hues that marked the end of the growing season. The Hutchinson homestead was smaller and more modest than the Barrett ranch, but it showed signs of careful maintenance despite its owner's reputation for unfriendliness. The fences were in good repair, the buildings were weathertight, and the Yauvandi, few head of cattle visible in the near pasture, appeared healthy and well tended. Whatever else might be said about Silas Hutchinson, he was clearly a competent rancher. Eliza approached the house slowly, giving its occupant plenty of time to observe her arrival and decide whether to respond to her presence. She had learned from her father that successful negotiation often began long before the first words were spoken, with careful attention to the other party's comfort and dignity. "Mr. Hutchinson?" She called from a respectful distance from the front porch. "I'm Eliza Barrett from the neighboring ranch. I wondered if I might have a moment of your time." For several long minutes, nothing stirred except the wind in the bare cottonwood branches. Then the front door opened slowly, revealing a tall, spare man with snow-white hair and suspicious dark eyes. Silas Hutchinson looked to be in his 70s. His face weathered by decades of frontier life, but his posture still straight and strong. "Barrett's new wife, I suppose," he said without preamble, his voice gravelly from disuse. "Heard he'd taken another woman." "What do you want?" The blunt question might have intimidated a less determined visitor, but Eliza had expected little in the way of social pleasantries. "I brought you some fresh bread and preserves," she said simply, holding up her basket. "Thought you might enjoy them, and I hoped we might get acquainted as neighbors should." Silas studied her with the intense scrutiny of a man accustomed to looking for tricks and deceptions. "Neighbors, is it? Your husband been trying to get use of my east pasture for years. Suppose this is his new strategy, send the wife to butter up the old fool." "Actually, Mr. Barrett doesn't know I'm here," Eliza said truthfully. "This visit was my own idea, and it has nothing to do with business arrangements. I simply thought it was time I introduced myself properly." The lie came easily, justified by her belief that establishing personal connection was more important. An immediate honesty about motives. She could see uncertainty flicker across the old man's face as he tried to categorize her approach within his framework of expectations. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose you'd better come up on the porch." Then, "It's cold standing in that wind." It was a grudging invitation, but Eliza accepted it gracefully, settling herself on one of the wooden chairs that faced the autumn landscape. She unpacked her basket without ceremony, setting out the bread and preserves as if she were arranging a picnic rather than conducting a diplomatic mission. "This is fine work," Silas said after sampling the bread, his tone betraying surprise at its quality. "Been a long time since I tasted baking this good. My Martha used to make bread like this before the consumption took her." The mention of his late wife opened a door that Eliza had hoped to find. "How long has it been?" she asked gently. 15 years come Christmas," he replied, his voice softening with memory. 15 years of cooking my own meals and mending my own clothes and talking to nobody but the cattle and the horses. The loneliness in his admission was unmistakable, and Eliza felt a rush of compassion for this proud, isolated man. "It must be very difficult, managing everything alone. I don't know how you've done it all these years." "You do what you have to do," Silas said with frontier stoicism. "Nobody else is going to do it for you." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the cattle move slowly across the distant pasture. When Eliza finally broached the subject of the temporary grazing arrangement, she did so as one neighbor asking another for help, rather than as a business proposition requiring negotiation. "We've had a request from a cattle drive that needs temporary grazing while they wait out this weather system," she said conversationally. "Unfortunately, it would mean some additional activity near your eastern boundary. I wanted to let you know about it personally and ask if you foresee any problems that might affect your operations." The careful phrasing acknowledged his right to object while making it clear that she was seeking cooperation rather than demanding compliance. Silas considered the matter with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to weighing all angles. "How many head, and for how long?" he asked finally. "About 200, probably no more than 2 weeks," Eliza replied. "They're experienced drovers, so there shouldn't be any problems with strays or property damage." 2 weeks, Silas mused. That would take us right up to fair time, wouldn't it? The mention of the county fair surprised Eliza, who hadn't expected their reclusive neighbor to be aware of community events. "Are you planning to attend?" "Haven't been in years," he admitted, "but I used to enjoy the livestock competitions. Raised some fine horses in my day, won a few ribbons myself." He paused, then added with obvious reluctance, "Gets lonely sometimes, missing all the visiting and carrying on." Eliza sensed an opportunity that went beyond the immediate business at hand. "Perhaps this year you might consider attending again. I'm sure the community would welcome your participation." "Don't know about that," Silas said doubtfully. "Been out of touch too long. Wouldn't know anyone anymore." "I'm sure that's not true," Eliza replied warmly. "Good neighbors are always remembered, and I suspect there are many people who would be pleased to see you again." By the time she prepared to leave, Silas had not only agreed to the grazing arrangement, but had extracted a promise that she would visit again soon to share more of her excellent baking. More importantly, she had planted the seed of an idea that might bring their isolated neighbor back into the community where he belonged. The ride back to the Barrett Ranch gave her time to reflect on the afternoon's success and what it might mean for her growing confidence in her role as ranch mistress. She had solved a practical problem through patience and diplomacy, demonstrated that her skills extended beyond household management, and perhaps begun the process of healing a long-standing community rift. When she reached home, she found Colt waiting on the front porch with obvious anxiety. "How did it go?" he asked before she had even dismounted. "Very well," she replied, accepting his help down from the saddle. "Mr. Hutchinson has agreed to the arrangement, and I think we may have made a new friend in the bargain." The relief and admiration in Colt's expression was worth every moment of nervous uncertainty she had experienced during the visit. For the first time since their marriage, she saw him look at her not just as a capable household manager, but as a true partner whose judgment and skills complemented his own. That evening, as they shared supper and she recounted the details of her diplomatic success, Eliza noticed that something had shifted in the careful distance Colt usually maintained. He listened to her account with genuine interest, asked thoughtful questions about her approach, and even smiled slightly when she described Silas Hutchinson's surprise at finding himself enjoying company after 15 years of solitude. "You did well today," he said as they cleared the table together. "Better than I would have done, certainly. Silas and I have been neighbors for 20 years, but you accomplished more in one afternoon than I've managed in all that time." Praise warmed her more than she cared to admit, representing not just acknowledgement of her success, but recognition of her value as a person whose contributions mattered. She was learning that respect, once earned, could be the foundation for deeper feelings if nurtured with patience and wisdom, got as she prepared for bed that night. Eliza thought about the blue ribbon she had found that morning and what it represented, about the life Sarah Barrett had built on this ranch. Community involvement, shared celebrations, the kind of normal pleasures that made hard work meaningful. Perhaps these things could return to the Barrett ranch if approached with the same care and diplomacy she had used with their difficult. Change, she was learning, often began with small steps and patient persistence rather than dramatic gestures. Like the late autumn flowers that continued to bloom despite the approaching frost, some good things could flourish even in challenging circumstances if tended with sufficient care and determination. The pressed wildflower bookmark slipped from the pages of Sarah's poetry collection like a whispered memory, its delicate petals still holding traces of purple despite years of careful preservation. Eliza found it while organizing the library shelves at Colt's request, part of his continued effort to make the house less of a monument and more of a living space. The flower appeared to be a prairie violet, pressed between the pages of a volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets, marking a poem about enduring love. She held the fragile bookmark carefully, understanding that it represented more than mere decoration. Sarah had chosen to preserve this particular flower, perhaps picked during a romantic walk with her husband, perhaps discovered during a moment of private reflection. Either way, it spoke of a woman who found beauty worth saving in the smallest details of daily life. She loved poetry, Colt said quietly, appearing at her elbow as she examined the delicate artifact. "Used to read aloud in the evenings while I worked on account books," said the rhythm of verse helped her think through difficult problems. This revelation surprised Eliza, who had not imagined the practical, accomplished woman she had learned about as someone who turned to literature for solace. What were her favorites? Browning, mostly. Some Wordsworth when she was feeling philosophical. She said poetry helped her understand her own heart better than any sermon or philosophical treatise. He paused, studying the bookmark in Eliza's hands. "That violet came from the meadow where I proposed to her. She picked it while I was working up the courage to ask the question." The intimate detail was offered without his usual defensive distance, and Eliza treasured the trust it represented. She must have been very happy that day. "Happiest I ever saw her," Colt confirmed, his voice carrying warmth that had been absent during their previous conversations about his late wife. "Danced around that meadow like a child at Christmas, singing at the top of her lungs. Said she'd been waiting 2 years for me to come to my senses." Eliza smiled at the image of young Sarah celebrating her engagement with such unguarded joy. "How long did you court her?" 3 years, all told," Colt replied, settling into the chair beside the reading table. "Met her at a church social when she was 19. Took me that long to convince myself I was worthy of someone like her." The admission revealed a vulnerability that Eliza had not suspected in the confident, successful man she had married. The idea that Colt Barrett had once doubted his own worth seemed almost impossible given his current position and accomplishments. "What convinced you that you were?" she asked gently. "She did," he said simply. "Told me that love wasn't about being worthy. It was about being willing to grow into the person your partner believed you could become. Said she didn't want someone perfect. She wanted someone real." The philosophy behind Sarah's words resonated deeply with Eliza's own understanding of human relationships. True partnership, it seemed, was built on acceptance of imperfection and mutual commitment to becoming better versions of themselves. She sounds like a wise woman, Eliza said, carefully replacing the bookmark in the poetry volume. Wiser then. I deserved, Colt agreed. But she never made me feel inadequate for not being as naturally good as she was. Just encouraged me to try harder, be better, think beyond my own interests. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, surrounded by the books that had once provided entertainment and solace for his first marriage. Eliza wondered if he missed those evening reading sessions, the shared quiet that came from pursuing intellectual interests together. Do you still enjoy poetry? She asked carefully, not wanting to probe too deeply into painful territory. Haven't read much since Sarah passed, he admitted. Seemed like something that belonged to our life together, not something I should continue alone. The comment revealed how completely he had shut down the parts of himself that had flourished during his marriage, treating not just love but intellectual curiosity and aesthetic appreciation as luxuries he no longer deserved. It was a kind of emotional punishment that had impoverished his life far beyond the loss of companionship. Perhaps someday you might find pleasure in it again, Eliza suggested gently. Good poetry belongs to everyone who can appreciate it, regardless of their circumstances. Colt studied her with the careful attention he usually reserved for evaluating business propositions. Do you read poetry yourself? Some, she replied honestly. My education was practical rather than classical, but I've always found comfort in verse that speaks to universal experiences. Elizabeth Browning's sonnets, particularly they, have a way of capturing feelings that are difficult to express in ordinary conversation. Sarah's favorite was the 43rd sonnet. Colt said unexpectedly. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. She used to quote it when she was feeling particularly sentimental. The famous love poem was one that Eliza knew by heart, having turned to it during her own lonely moments in Boston, when marriage seemed an impossible dream. The irony of discussing such passionate verse with a man who had married her for purely practical reasons was not lost on her, but she appreciated the trust implicit in his sharing such personal memories. It's a beautiful expression of complete devotion, she said carefully. The kind of love that transforms both people involved. Yes, Colt agreed quietly. It was. The conversation might have grown awkward at that point, weighted with reminders of the emotional distance that separated their practical arrangement from the romantic marriage he had known before. Instead, they were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Chun, who bustled into the library with obvious excitement. Mrs. Barrett, she called, there's a woman here to see you. Says her name is Martha Hutchinson, and she's Silas Hutchinson's daughter-in-law. Come to call. The unexpected visitor represented a significant development in Eliza's diplomatic efforts with their difficult neighbor. If Silas had spoken favorably enough about her visit to encourage family members to call, it suggested that her patient approach was yielding results beyond the immediate business arrangement. Please show her into the parlor, Eliza said, rising to greet their guest. And perhaps you could prepare tea and some of those molasses cookies we baked yesterday. Martha Hutchinson proved to be a woman of middle years with intelligent eyes, and the practical manner of someone accustomed to frontier hardships. She was accompanied by 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 years and a girl slightly younger, who hung back shyly behind their mother's skirts. Mrs. Barrett, Martha said as they settled in the parlor, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but my father-in-law has spoken of nothing but your visit for the past 3 days. He sent me to invite you and Mr. Barrett to Sunday dinner next week. The invitation was so unexpected that Eliza had to struggle to maintain her composure. In the space of a single afternoon visit, she had apparently succeeded in breaking through 15 years of social isolation and inspiring the reclusive widower to reach out to his neighbors. We would be honored to accept, she replied warmly. Please tell Mr. Hutchinson that we appreciate his kindness. There's more, Martha continued, her eyes sparkling with what appeared to be suppressed mirth. He's decided to enter his best moray in the county fair horse competition, and he wants to know if you think he should get a new shirt for the occasion. The image of the proud, cantankerous old man worrying about his appearance for a social event he hadn't attended in over a decade was both touching and amusing. Clearly, Eliza's encouragement had struck deeper than she had realized. I think a new shirt would be an excellent investment, she said diplomatically. First impressions matter, and if his mare is as fine as I suspect, he'll want to look the part of a successful horseman. As Martha and her children visited, sharing local news and gossip with the enthusiasm of people starved for social contact, Eliza learned more about the community dynamics she had married into. The Hutchinson family had been among the original settlers, respected for their integrity and hospitality until grief and isolation had turned Silas into the territory's most famous hermit. His return to social life would be noticed and celebrated by neighbors who had long missed his participation in community affairs. Father Hutchinson was always one of the wisest men in the territory, Martha confided as they shared tea and cookies. But losing Mother Hutchinson hit him so hard that he just withdrew from everything and everyone. We've been praying for years that something would bring him back to himself. Sometimes all we need is a reminder that we're still welcome, Eliza replied thoughtfully. Grief can make us forget that other people miss our company. After Martha and her children departed, laden with preserves and leftover cookies, Eliza found herself reflecting on the unexpected consequences of her diplomatic mission. What had begun as a practical solution to a business problem had apparently sparked a much larger renewal of community relationships. "You've accomplished something remarkable," Colt said when she recounted the visit's details during their evening meal. The Hutchinson family has been isolated for so long that most folks had given up hope of ever seeing Silas at community gatherings again. "He just needed to know that he was still wanted," she replied. "Isolation feeds on itself the longer you stay away, the harder it becomes to believe you'll be welcomed back." Colt looked up from his account books with an expression that held warmth rather than the usual polite distance. "Good night, Mrs. Barrett, and thank you for bringing some of that spirit back to our community. Sarah would have appreciated what you're doing for the Hutchinson family." As Eliza prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's revelations and what they suggested about the gradual evolution of her marriage. Colt was beginning to trust her with pieces of his past, sharing memories that had been locked away since Sarah's death. More importantly, he was starting to see her as someone whose actions and opinions mattered beyond their immediate practical value. The pressed wildflower bookmark had represented more than Sarah's love of poetry. It had symbolized the preservation of beauty and meaning in the midst of ordinary life. Perhaps that was what she was learning to do here on the Kansas prairie, finding ways to cultivate joy and connection, despite the harsh realities of frontier existence that change was coming to. The Barrett Ranch, as gradual and inevitable as the changing seasons. Like the late autumn flowers that continued to bloom despite the approaching frost, some forms of hope could flourish even in the most challenging circumstances if tended with patience, wisdom, and faith in the possibility of renewal. The crumpled telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning when the first frost had painted the prairie grass silver and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Billy Mason brought it from town, his young face troubled as he handed the yellow paper to Eliza with obvious reluctance. The Western Union envelope bore her name in careful script, but the message within would shatter the careful peace she had built over the past 2 months. Eliza stop made terrible mistake, stop marriage to Sally, Arnold stop coming to claim you, as promised stop arrive November 10th, stop Thomas Whitman. The words swam before her eyes as she read them once, twice, and then a third time, hoping that repetition might somehow change their meaning. Thomas Whitman, the mail-order groom who had abandoned her for another woman, was returning to claim her as if she were a piece of unclaimed baggage rather than a married woman who had built a new life from the ashes of his betrayal. Her hands trembled as she folded the telegram, acutely aware that Billy Mason was watching her with the sharp curiosity of youth. News traveled fast in small communities, and she had no doubt that the boy had already guessed the general nature of the messages. Contents. "Bad news, Mrs. Barrett?" he asked with the kind of innocent concern that made her heart ache. "Unexpected news," she replied carefully, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Nothing that can't be managed with proper thought and planning." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, her mind was racing through the implications of Thomas Whitman's return. What legal standing did her marriage to Colt have if her original intended groom claimed she had been promised to him first? More troubling still, what would this mean for the fragile trust and growing partnership she had built with her husband. She found Colt in the barn, examining a mare that was due to foal any day. He looked up as she approached, immediately noting her pale complexion and the telegram clutched in her hands. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. Wordlessly, she handed him the yellow paper and watched his face darken as he read Thomas Whitman's presumptuous message. When he finished, he folded the telegram with deliberate precision and met her eyes, with an expression that was completely unreadable. "So," he said quietly, "your original groom has reconsidered his choice." "It appears so," Eliza replied, struggling to keep her voice level. "Though I fail to understand how he can claim any right to claim me when I'm already legally married to someone else." Colt was silent for a long moment, his ice-blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "Are you?" he asked finally. "Am I what?" "Legally married," he clarified. Our ceremony was performed quickly, without the usual posting of banns or waiting periods. If Whitman can prove prior contract or intention, there might be grounds for challenging the validity of our union. The possibility hadn't occurred to her, but she realized with growing alarm that frontier marriage law was often informal and subject to interpretation. Her marriage to Colt had been a desperate expedient, arranged hastily without the careful legal preparations that normally accompanied such unions. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "I'm saying that if Thomas Whitman arrives with proper documentation of your original agreement and legal representation to challenge our marriage, you might find yourself free to honor your first commitment, whether you want to or not." The clinical way he discussed the possibility cut her more deeply than anger would have done. After 2 months of building partnership and mutual respect, he was retreating into the emotional distance that had characterized their early interactions. "And if that happens?" she pressed, needing to understand where she truly stood with him. Colt turned back to examining the pregnant mare, his attention apparently focused entirely on the animal's condition. "Then you'll have to decide which life you prefer," he said without looking at her. "The one you planned or the one you've been living?" The dismissive tone stung like a physical blow. She had thought they were building something meaningful together, had believed that her contributions to the ranch and community had earned her a place in his regard, if not his heart. To have him speak as if she were merely a temporary arrangement that could be dissolved without consequence felt like a betrayal of everything they had shared. "I see," she said quietly, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "Then I suppose we must wait and see what Mr. Whitman proposes when he arrives." She turned to leave, but Colt's voice stopped her at the barn door. "Eliza." The use of her given name, rather than the formal address he usually employed, made her pause. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that this arrangement has been more satisfactory than I expected when we made our agreement." It was perhaps the closest thing to a declaration of feeling he was capable of making, but it fell far short of what she needed to hear in that moment. "Thank you," she said formally. "That's very kind of you to say." The days that followed passed in a haze of forced normalcy and underlying tension. Eliza continued her household duties with mechanical precision, preparing meals and managing domestic affairs, while her mind churned through possibilities and probabilities. The ranch hands seemed to sense that something was amiss, their usual easy banter subdued during meals, their glances flickering between her and Colt, with obvious concern. Mrs. Chun proved to be her most reliable confidant, listening without judgment as Eliza wrestled with questions that had no clear answers. What kind of man abandons a woman and then expects her to wait around until he changes his mind again? The older woman asked indignantly as they worked together in the kitchen. "The kind who sees women as property rather than people," Eliza replied bitterly. "Thomas Whitman apparently believes that his original claim supersedes any choices I might have made in his absence." "And what does Mr. Barrett believe?" Mrs. Chun inquired shrewdly. That was the question that kept Eliza awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering whether Colt viewed their marriage as a contract that could be legally dissolved or as a commitment that ought to be defended regardless of outside challenges. His emotional withdrawal since receiving the telegram suggested that he was already distancing himself from whatever pain might result from her departure. The answer came sooner than expected when Deputy Marshal Kane rode out to the Ranch 3, days before Thomas Whitman's projected arrival. The lawman's expression was grave as he dismounted and asked to speak with both Eliza and Colt about matters of legal importance. "I've been researching the law regarding your situation," he told them as they gathered in Colt's study. "The truth is, frontier marriage law is complicated, and there's precedent for challenging unions that were performed hastily without proper documentation of prior obligations." Eliza felt her heart sink as he continued his explanation. "If Whitman can prove that you had a legally binding agreement to marry him, and if he can demonstrate that your marriage to Mr. Barrett was performed under duress or without full disclosure of existing obligations, a territorial judge might rule that the Barrett union is invalid. What would constitute proof of a legally binding agreement?" Colt asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Written correspondence indicating mutual consent, witness testimony about the nature of the relationship, evidence of financial arrangements or exchanges related to the proposed marriage," Marshal Kane replied. "From what I understand, mail-order marriages often involve considerable documentation." Eliza remembered with growing dread the careful letters she and Thomas Whitman had exchanged, the formal agreements about household arrangements and financial responsibilities, the witnesses who had been present when she announced her intention to travel to Kansas for the wedding. All of that evidence could be used to support his claim that she had been legally committed to him before she ever met Colt Barrett. "However," the marshal continued, "there's also the matter of abandonment and breach of contract on Whitman's part. He failed to honor his agreement when he married another woman, which could be argued as releasing you from any obligation to him. The question is whether a judge would see it that way. What's your assessment of our chances if this goes to court?" Colt asked, leaning back in his chair with the kind of calculated calm he displayed when evaluating business risks. Marshal Kane removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Honestly, it could go either way. Judge Morrison tends to favor established contracts over hasty arrangements, but he also has strong feelings about men who abandon their responsibilities and then try to reclaim them when convenient." The uncertainty was almost worse than a definitive negative ruling would have been. Eliza found herself caught between hope and despair, unable to plan for a future that might be decided by legal technicalities and judicial temperament rather than her own choices and feelings. "There's something else you should know," Marshal Kane added reluctantly. "Whitman isn't coming alone. He's bringing a lawyer from Topeka and at least 2 witnesses who can testify about the original marriage agreement. He's taking this matter very seriously." After the marshal departed, Eliza and Colt sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in private contemplation of what the next few days might bring. The autumn light slanting through the study windows seemed thinner somehow, as if even the sun had withdrawn its warmth in anticipation of coming storms. "I want you to know," Eliza said finally, "that regardless of what any judge might rule about legal technicalities, I consider myself to be your wife in every way that matters. Thomas Whitman forfeited any claim to my loyalty when he chose another woman over the commitment he had made to me." Colt turned to study her with an expression that was unreadable but intense. "And if the law disagrees with your personal feelings? If you're forced to choose between honoring a legal obligation and maintaining an invalid marriage?" The question struck at the heart of her deepest fears. She had built a life at the Barrett Ranch, had found purpose and belonging in ways she had never expected. The thought of being forced to abandon all of that, to honor a commitment to a man who had already proved himself untrustworthy, was almost unbearable. "Then I suppose I'll have to decide which matters more," she said quietly. "Legal obligations or moral ones?" "That's not a decision you should have to make," Colt replied, his voice carrying an edge of anger that surprised her. "Whitman had his chance and threw it away. He has no right to disrupt the life you've built here just because his second choice didn't work out as planned." A protective note in his voice gave her the first real hope she had felt since receiving the telegram. Perhaps their marriage meant more to him than the practical arrangement he had originally described. Perhaps he was beginning to care about her as a person, rather than simply appreciating her usefulness as a household manager. "What will you do if the judge rules in his favor?" she asked, needing to know whether he would fight for their marriage or accept its dissolution with the same practical resignation he had shown when entering into it. Colt was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration rather than impulsive emotion. "I'll do whatever is necessary to protect what we've built together," he said firmly. "Legal technicalities be damned. You're my wife, Eliza, and I don't give up what's mine without a fight." The simple declaration hit her with unexpected force. For the first time since their wedding, he had claimed her not just as a practical partner, but as someone who belonged with him in a way that transcended convenience or mutual benefit. The emotional barriers he had maintained so carefully seemed to crack slightly, revealing glimpses of deeper feelings he had been protecting behind walls of grief and caution. That evening, as they prepared for what might be one of their last suppers together as husband and wife, Eliza found herself paying attention to details she had previously taken for granted. The way Colt held her chair when she sat down, the careful attention he paid to her preferences when serving the meal, the comfortable silence that had developed between them during their evening conversations. All of these small intimacies had become precious in the face of their potential loss. "Whatever happens when Thomas Whitman arrives," she said as they cleared the table together, "I want you to know that these past 2 months have been the happiest of my adult life. Not because of the material comfort you've provided, but because of the respect and partnership you've offered. I've never felt more valued as a person than I have here on this ranch." Colt paused in his task of stacking plates, his hands going still as he absorbed her words. "You've given this place something it's been missing since Sarah died," he said quietly. "Not just domestic management, but life and warmth and purpose. Whatever legal complications Whitman might create, that contribution can't be taken away or invalidated." They stood facing each other across the kitchen table, the dinner dishes forgotten, as the weight of unspoken feelings settled between them. Eliza found herself memorizing the details of his face, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years in the prairie sun, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way his expression had gradually softened over the weeks of their marriage. "Colt," she said, using his given name for the first time since their wedding night, "if I have a choice in this matter, if the decision is mine to make rather than being imposed by legal mandate, I want you to know that I choose this life. I choose you." The simple declaration seemed to reach him in ways that weeks of careful domestic partnership had not. He stepped around the table, closing the distance between them with a kind of deliberate movement that spoke of important decisions being made. "And I choose you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Not because it's practical or convenient, but because you've become essential to my happiness in ways I didn't think were possible anymore." For a moment, Eliza thought he might kiss her, not the brief formal gesture of their wedding ceremony, but a real kiss that acknowledged the feelings they had been dancing around for weeks. Instead, he took her hands in his, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever Thomas Whitman thinks he can prove or claim, he can't change the fact that you've made this house a home again," he said firmly. "And I'll be damned if I let him take that away from either of us." The conviction in his voice filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. Whatever legal challenges lay ahead, whatever complications Thomas Whitman's arrival might bring, she finally knew where she stood with the man she had married out of necessity, but was learning to love out of choice. The crumpled telegram that had brought such devastating news now seemed less like a harbinger of doom and more like a test that would determine the true strength of what they had built together. Some challenges, Eliza reflected, had the power to destroy relationships that were built on weak foundations, while others served to reveal the depth and resilience of connections that had grown strong enough to weather any storm that tomorrow would bring whatever complications Thomas Whitman chose to create. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, standing in the kitchen of the Barrett Ranch, beside a man who had finally learned to value what he had gained more than what he had lost. Sarah's locket lay warm in Eliza's palm, its delicate gold surface catching the lamplight as she examined the intricate engraving around its edges. Colt had presented it to her that morning, his hands trembling slightly as he fastened the delicate chain around her neck, the first genuinely intimate gesture he had made since their wedding 2 months ago. "It was my grandmother's originally," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah wore it every day of our marriage. I want you to have it now, as a symbol of what you've come to mean to me." The weight of the locket against her chest felt like both a blessing and a responsibility. To wear something so precious to Sarah's memory represented a level of acceptance and trust that Eliza had never dared to hope for. More significantly, it suggested that Colt was finally ready to move forward from grief toward the possibility of new love. Thomas Whitman would arrive tomorrow, bringing with him lawyers and witnesses and legal challenges that could tear apart everything she had built here on the Kansas prairie. But tonight, wearing Sarah's locket and feeling the solid warmth of Colt's commitment, Eliza found herself filled with quiet determination rather than fear. "Are you certain about this?" she had asked as he stepped back to admire how the necklace looked against her blue calico dress. "If Mr. Whitman's lawyers see me wearing it, they might use it as evidence that our marriage is merely a replacement for your first one, rather than a legitimate union in its own right." Colt's response had been swift and decisive. "Let them make what arguments they please. You're wearing it because you're my wife, and because you deserve to be honored as such. If that strengthens their case somehow, so be it. I'm done hiding what you mean to me." The transformation in his manner over the past few days had been remarkable to witness. The distant, carefully controlled man she had married was giving way to someone warmer and more emotionally available, as if the threat of losing her had finally broken through the protective barriers he had maintained around his heart. Now, as evening settled over the ranch and they made their final preparations for tomorrow's confrontation, Eliza reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman in Boston, willing to marry a stranger for the promise of security. Tonight she was the cherished wife of a man she had learned to love deeply, preparing to fight for a marriage that had become the young foundation of her happiness. "The men want to attend tomorrow's hearing," Colt said, entering the parlor where she sat with her needlework. "Tom says they're prepared to testify about your character and your contributions to the ranch if needed." Loyalty of the ranch hands touched her deeply. Over the past weeks, as word of Thomas Whitman's challenge had spread through the community, she had been overwhelmed by the support offered by people she had come to think of as family. "That's very kind of them," she replied, setting aside her mending to give him her full attention. "Though I hope their testimony won't be necessary. This should be a matter of law rather than character assessment." "Character matters more than you might think in frontier justice," Colt said, settling into the chair beside hers. "Judge Morrison has considerable discretion in how he interprets contractual obligations, especially when moral considerations come into play." They had spent hours over the past 3 days reviewing the details of her original correspondence with Thomas Whitman, searching for anything that might undermine his claim to a binding agreement. The exercise had been both painful and illuminating, forcing Eliza to confront how desperate and naive she had been when she first agreed to marry a man she had never met. "I keep thinking about the woman I was when I wrote those letters," she said quietly, "so frightened of being alone that I was willing to promise myself to someone whose character I knew nothing about. It seems like another lifetime now." "You were doing what you had to do to survive," Colt replied gently. "There's no shame in that. But you're not that desperate woman anymore, and you don't owe Thomas Whitman anything just because he was your first option for escape." The confident way he spoke about her worth and her right to choose her own future filled her with gratitude. This was the man she had glimpsed occasionally during their courtship, protective, passionate, willing to fight for what mattered to him. The threat of losing her had apparently awakened feelings he had thought died with Sarah. "What will you say if Judge Morrison asks you why you married me so quickly?" she asked, voicing one of her persistent worries about tomorrow's hearing. Colt considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer could determine the outcome of their case. "I'll tell him the truth," he said finally. "That you were a woman in need of protection, that I was a man in need of companionship, and that what began as a practical arrangement has become something much more valuable than either of us expected. And if he asks whether you love me? The question slipped out before she could stop it, revealing more of her own feelings than she had intended. The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Eliza held her breath, afraid that she had pushed too hard for declarations he wasn't ready to make. If he asks me that, Colt said slowly, I'll tell him that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone again. That you've brought light back into a house that had been dark for 5 years. That losing you would be like losing Sarah all over again, except this time it would be through human cruelty rather than natural tragedy. The words hit her with the force of revelation. In all their careful conversations about mutual respect and partnership, he had never spoken so directly about his feelings. To hear him acknowledge love felt like a gift beyond anything she had dared to hope for. Colt, she whispered, rising from her chair to kneel beside his. Do you mean that? Every word, he replied, taking her hands in his and looking directly into her eyes. I fought against it for weeks, telling myself it was disloyal to Sarah's memory. But the truth is that love isn't diminished by being shared. If anything, learning to love you has helped me understand how precious what Sarah and I had really was. Tears gathered in her eyes as she absorbed the magnitude of his declaration. I love you too, she said simply. Not because you rescued me from a difficult situation, but because of who you are, your integrity, your kindness, the way you've built something meaningful here on this land. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart race. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest I've been since Sarah died. You've given me back the ability to hope for the future. They might have sealed their mutual declarations with the kind of passionate embrace that had been building between them for weeks, but the moment was interrupted by urgent knocking at the front door. Tom Hendricks's voice called through the tone. Wood, carrying news that would change everything about tomorrow's confrontation. Boss, Mrs. Barrett, you need to hear this right away. Colt rose to answer the door, and Tom entered with obvious excitement, followed by a woman Eliza didn't recognize, a small, nervous-looking person in traveling clothes who clutched a worn carpet-bag with white-knuckled fingers. This is Sally Henderson, Tom announced. Well, Sally Whitman now, I suppose. She just arrived on the evening train from Topeka, and she's got quite a story to tell about your Mr. Thomas Whitman. The appearance of Thomas Whitman's second wife was so unexpected that Eliza could only stare in amazement. What could possibly have brought the woman here on the eve of the legal hearing that would determine her own fate? Sally Whitman proved to be younger than Eliza had expected, probably no more than 22, with the kind of fragile beauty that suggested she had been sheltered from life's harsher realities. But her eyes held a determination that belied her delicate appearance. And when she spoke, her voice carried the firm conviction of someone who had made difficult decisions. Mrs. Barrett, she said, I've come to tell you the truth about Thomas Whitman and why I left him 3 days after our wedding. If that man thinks he can claim you as his legal wife while treating women like property to be traded and discarded, he's about to learn otherwise. The dramatic revelation promised to change everything about tomorrow's legal battle, but it also raised new questions about Thomas Whitman's character and motivations. If his second marriage had failed so quickly and so completely, what did that suggest about his fitness as a husband for anyone? Please, sit down and tell us everything, Colt said, gesturing toward the sofa. If you have information that bears on tomorrow's hearing, we need to understand the full situation. As Sally Whitman settled herself and began to tell her story, Eliza felt Sarah's locket resting warm against her heart, a tangible reminder of the love and trust that had brought her to this moment. Whatever revelations the evening might bring, she was no longer the desperate woman who had begged Colt Barrett to marry her. She was a woman who had found love, purpose, and belonging, and she was prepared to fight for all of it. The next few hours would determine whether her marriage could survive the legal challenges Thomas Whitman had brought against it. But regardless of what technicalities and procedures might unfold in Judge Morrison's courtroom, Eliza knew that she had already won the only victory that truly mattered, the heart of a good man who valued her not for what she could provide, but for who she had become. Tomorrow would bring its own battles and decisions. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, in the home she had helped to build, beside the man she had learned to love, wearing a locket that symbolized both honoring the past and embracing the future. Some foundations, once properly laid, could withstand any storm that might come against them. The golden circle of light cast by the parlor lamps seemed to hold them all in a bubble of warmth and safety, even as the autumn wind rattled the windows and reminded them that winter was coming. But they would face whatever challenges arose together, as a family bound not just by legal documents, but by the deeper ties of love, respect, and mutual commitment to each other's happiness. Sally Whitman's unexpected arrival had introduced new variables into an already complex situation, but it had also brought the possibility of revelations that might finally put Thomas Whitman's claims to rest forever. As Eliza listened to the young woman's story unfold, she felt a growing sense of confidence that truth and justice would prevail. That love built on solid foundations could weather any temporary storm. The handwritten love letter trembled in Eliza's fingers as she read Colt's careful script by the morning light streaming through their bedroom window. He had left it on her dressing table some time before dawn, along with a single prairie rose from the last blooms of the season, his first written expression of feelings that had been growing steadily since the day they wed. "My dearest Eliza," the letter began, "words have never come easily to me when speaking of matters of the heart, but the possibility of losing you has made silence impossible. You came into my life when I thought my capacity for love had died with Sarah, and you have shown me that the human heart has room for more joy than I ever imagined possible. Whatever Judge Morrison decides today, I want you to know that you have been the greatest blessing of my adult life. Not because you managed my household, or charmed difficult neighbors, or proved yourself capable in crisis, though you have done all of those things with grace and wisdom. You have been a blessing because you saw past my grief to the man I could become again, and you loved that man enough to wait for him to remember himself. If the law forces us apart today, know that you will carry my heart with you wherever you go. If it allows us to remain together, know that I will spend every remaining day of my life proving myself worthy of your love. Either way, you have transformed me from a man existing in the shadow of loss to someone ready to embrace whatever future we can build together. All my love, Colt." She pressed the letter to her chest, feeling Sarah's locket warm against her heart. Beneath the paper, in just a few hours, she would stand before Judge Morrison and learn whether her marriage would be validated or dissolved, whether her future lay with the man she had grown to love or with the stranger who had abandoned her and now sought to reclaim her. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the courthouse at Dusty Crossings, and already she could hear the sounds of preparation echoing from the kitchen below. Mrs. Chun was putting together a breakfast that none of them would likely have appetite to eat, while the ranch hands prepared to ride into town as character witnesses if needed. Sally Whitman's revelations the previous evening had provided shocking insight into Thomas Whitman's true character. The young woman had described a marriage that began with deception and quickly deteriorated into emotional cruelty and financial manipulation. Thomas had married her for her inheritance, only to discover that her father's estate was tied up in legal complications that might take years to resolve. When she proved less financially valuable than expected, he had begun looking for ways to escape their union while keeping whatever assets he could claim. "He never loved me," Sally had said with quiet dignity. "I was simply a means to an end, just as you were before me." When he learned that you had married well and might represent a better opportunity, he decided to challenge your marriage and reclaim you as his property. The calculated coldness of such reasoning had appalled everyone present, but it had also provided exactly the kind of evidence they needed to demonstrate Thomas Whitman's unfitness as a husband and his opportunistic motivations for challenging Eliza's marriage to Colt. Now, as she prepared for the most important day of her adult life, Eliza found herself thinking not about legal technicalities and courtroom strategies, but about the simple human truths that had brought her to this moment. She had learned to love deeply and be loved in return. She had found purpose and belonging in a community that valued her contributions. She had discovered that happiness was possible even in circumstances that began with desperation and necessity. Whatever Judge Morrison decided, Those experiences could not be taken away from her. If she lost the legal battle and was forced to honor her original commitment to Thomas Whitman, she would carry the memory of true love as a source of strength through whatever trials lay ahead. If she won the right to remain with Colt, she would treasure that victory as the beginning of a life built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. The blue dress she chose for the hearing had been Sarah's favorite, according to Mrs. Chun, a simple but elegant garment that conveyed both respectability and quiet confidence. As she fastened Sarah's locket around her neck and pinned her hair in the severe style appropriate for formal occasions, Eliza reflected on how much she had changed since arriving in Kansas 3 months ago. The desperate woman who had begged Colt Barrett to marry her had been transformed into someone who understood her own worth, who could stand before a judge and argue for her right to choose her own future. The love and respect she had found in her marriage had given her the strength to fight for what mattered most. Colt was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, resplendent in his best suit and radiating the kind of quiet authority that had made him successful in business and respected throughout the territory. But it was the warmth in his pale blue eyes when he saw her that made her heart race, not the cold assessment of their early acquaintance, but the tender regard of a man deeply in love. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm with formal courtesy that carried undertones of intimate affection. "Thank you," she replied, accepting his escort with the dignity of a woman who knew herself to be cherished. "Are you ready for this?" "I'm ready to fight for what's mine," he said firmly. "And what's mine is you, Mrs. Barrett. No legal technicality or opportunistic fortune hunter is going to change that if I have anything to say about it." The ride to town passed in companionable silence, their hands clasped together on the buggy seat as they watched the familiar landscape roll by under the pale November sky. The cottonwoods had shed most of their leaves, leaving bare branches that scratched against the gray clouds like delicate pen strokes. Winter was coming to the Kansas prairie, but Eliza felt warmed by the certainty of Colt's love and her own determination to secure their future together. The courthouse in Dusty Crossings was packed with spectators drawn by curiosity about the unusual case and sympathy for the couple whose marriage had become the subject of public debate. Eliza recognized faces from church socials and town gatherings, people who had come to respect her contributions to the community and were hoping to see justice prevail over legal manipulation. Thomas Whitman stood near the front of the courtroom, with his lawyer and witnesses, a man of medium height with brown hair and unremarkable features that suggested neither strength nor particular weakness. He looked, Eliza thought, exactly like what he was, an opportunist who had learned to present himself as respectable while pursuing his own advantage at others' expense. When their eyes met across the crowded room, she felt nothing but mild distaste for someone who had caused her considerable inconvenience. The desperate hope she had once invested in their planned marriage seemed like something from another lifetime, barely connected to the confident woman she had become. Judge Morrison called the court to order promptly at 10 o'clock, his weathered face stern, but not unkind as he surveyed the packed courtroom. He was known throughout the territory as a fair man who considered both legal precedent and human compassion, in making his decisions exactly the kind of judge who might be willing to look beyond technicalities to the deeper questions of justice and human welfare. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Whitman versus Barrett, concerning the validity of a marriage contract and claims of prior obligation," the judge announced. "Mr. Whitman, as the petitioner, you may present your case first." Thomas, Whitman's lawyer, a smooth-talking man from Topeka with expensive clothes and calculating eyes, rose to present an argument based entirely on legal technicalities and contractual obligations. He produced the correspondence between Thomas and Eliza, emphasizing the formal nature of their agreement and the witnesses who could testify to her commitment to marry his client. "Your Honor," the lawyer argued, "my client entered into a binding agreement with Miss Thornton, as she was then known, for the purpose of matrimony. When circumstances forced him to delay the fulfillment of that agreement, Miss Thornton did not wait for resolution of the complications, but instead hastily married another man. This represents a clear breach of contract that renders her subsequent marriage invalid." The argument was technically sound, but morally bankrupt. focusing entirely on legal obligations while ignoring the human cost of Thomas Whitman's abandonment and opportunistic motivations. As Eliza listened to herself being described as merely a party to a business transaction, she felt grateful for the love and respect that had taught her to value herself as more than a commodity to be traded between men when it came time for their defense. Colt's lawyer, a local attorney named Samuel Pierce, who had known both families for years, presented a very different picture of the situation. He emphasized Thomas Whitman's abandonment of his obligations, the desperate circumstances that had forced Eliza to seek alternative arrangements, and the genuine marriage that had developed between her and Colt despite its practical beginnings. "Your Honor," Samuel argued, "Mr. Whitman cannot claim the protection of a contract he himself violated when he married another woman and left. Miss Thornton, stranded without resources or recourse, Mrs. Barrett, as she is now properly known, entered into her marriage with my client in good faith after being abandoned by the petitioner. That marriage has been consummated and has produced a genuine partnership that deserves the protection of this court." The legal arguments continued for nearly an hour, with both sides citing precedents and technicalities that would ultimately guide Judge Morrison's decision. But Eliza found herself paying more attention to the human drama unfolding in the courtroom. The way Colt sat beside her with protective determination, the supportive faces of their friends and neighbors, the calculating expression on Thomas Whitman's face as he evaluated his chances of success when Judge Morrison called for a brief recess to consider the arguments presented. Eliza knew that the next few minutes would determine the course of her entire future. She had fought as hard as she could for the right to remain with the man she loved, but now the decision rested with someone else entirely. The freshly picked prairie roses in Colt's weathered hands trembled slightly as he stood before Judge Morrison's bench, their delicate petals a startling splash of color against the somber atmosphere of the courtroom. He had gathered them that morning from the last blooms of the season, a romantic gesture that would have seemed impossible from the cold, distant man Eliza had married 3 months ago. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom with quiet conviction, "I'd like to address this court, not as a defendant in a legal proceeding, but as a man who has found unexpected happiness and refuses to let it be destroyed by someone else's greed and opportunism." Judge Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face showing interest in this deviation from standard legal procedure. "You may speak, Mr. Barrett, though I'll remind you that this court is bound by law rather than sentiment." "I understand that, Your Honor," Colt replied, "but I believe the law is meant to serve justice, not enable injustice. And there would be no justice in forcing my wife to honor a commitment to a man who abandoned her when she needed him most." The simple words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and Eliza felt her heart swell with pride and love for this man who was willing to fight for their marriage before God and the entire community. This was not the cold, calculating rancher she had first encountered, but someone transformed by love into someone willing to be vulnerable in defense of what mattered most. "Thomas Whitman left my wife stranded at a railroad depot with no money, no prospects, and no protection," Colt continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "When she came to me asking for help, I offered her a marriage of convenience, because it seemed like the decent thing to do. What neither of us expected was that convenience would grow into something much more valuable, a true partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and yes, genuine love." He held up the prairie roses, their simple beauty a stark contrast to the legal documents and formal proceedings that surrounded them. "I picked these for my wife this morning, Your Honor, not because any law required it, but because she has brought joy back into a life that had been empty for 5 years. That's not something that can be dissolved by legal technicalities or transferred to someone else like a piece of property." Judge Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral, but Eliza caught a slight softening around his eyes that suggested Colt's words were having their intended effect. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, everyone present understanding that they were witnessing something more significant than a legal argument. They were seeing a man's heart laid bare in defense of love. "Mr. Whitman," the judge said, turning his attention to Thomas, "I'm curious to hear your response to these claims about your abandonment of Miss Thornton." What exactly were the circumstances that prevented you from honoring your original agreement? Thomas Whitman rose with obvious reluctance, his earlier confidence shaken by the emotional power of Colt's declaration. Your Honor, I was presented with an unexpected opportunity for marriage to Miss Henderson, whose family connections offered significant advantages for my business interests. I felt it would be irresponsible to pass up such an opportunity based on a mere correspondence relationship. The callous admission drew audible gasps from the courtroom audience. In trying to justify his actions, Thomas had revealed exactly the kind of calculating opportunism that made him unfit as a husband for any decent woman. So you abandoned your commitment to Miss Thornton for financial advantage? Judge Morrison asked, his tone sharpening with obvious disapproval. I made a practical business decision, Thomas replied, seemingly unaware of how damaging his honesty was proving to be. Marriage is fundamentally an economic arrangement. Your Honor, I chose the option that offered the best prospects for financial success. It was precisely the wrong thing to say in a courtroom filled with people who understood marriage as a sacred commitment between two people who chose to share their lives. Eliza heard murmurs of disgust from the gallery and saw several jurors shaking their heads in disapproval. Judge Morrison turned to Sally Whitman, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the courtroom throughout the proceedings. Mrs. Whitman, I understand you have testimony relevant to this case? Sally rose with quiet dignity, her small frame somehow managing to command the attention of the entire room. Yes, Your Honor. I married Thomas Whitman 3 months ago, believing him to be an honorable man seeking genuine partnership. I discovered within days that he was interested only in my inheritance and had no regard for my feelings or welfare as a person. She paused, gathering her courage before delivering the testimony that would destroy Thomas Whitman's case completely. When he learned that my father's estate was tied up in legal complications, he immediately began making inquiries about other women who might prove more financially advantageous. When he discovered that Eliza had married well, he decided to challenge her marriage and reclaim her as what he called a better investment. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs at this revelation of Thomas Whitman's mercenary motivations. Judge Morrison gavelled for order, his face dark with disapproval as he processed the implications of Sally's testimony. Mr. Whitman, the judge said sternly, are you prepared to deny these allegations about your motivations for challenging Mrs. Barrett's marriage? Thomas Whitman's face had gone pale as he realized how completely his case had collapsed. Your Honor, that is. My personal reasons for seeking to resolve this contractual dispute should not influence the legal merits of my claim. On the contrary, Judge Morrison replied sharply, your motivations are entirely relevant to this court's assessment of whether justice would be served by granting your petition. A man who treats marriage as a business transaction and women as investment opportunities has no standing to claim the protection of this court's authority. The judge paused, surveying the packed courtroom with the kind of measured attention that suggested he was about to render a decision that would be remembered throughout the territory for years to come. This court has heard arguments concerning the validity of a marriage between Colt Barrett and Eliza Thornton Barrett, challenged by Thomas Whitman on the basis of prior contractual obligations. Judge Morrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of final authority. Having considered all testimony and evidence presented, I am prepared to render my decision. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of autumn wind rattling the windows and the nervous breathing of spectators waiting to learn Eliza's fate. She felt Colt's hand close around hers, warm and steady, offering whatever comfort he could provide in the moments before they learned whether their marriage would survive this legal challenge. Mr. Whitman, the judge continued, your petition is based on the claim that Miss Thornton was contractually obligated to marry you before she entered into her marriage with Mr. Barrett. However, this court finds that you yourself violated any such contract when you abandoned Miss Thornton to marry another woman for financial advantage. Judge Morrison's voice grew stern as he addressed Thomas directly. Furthermore, your admitted motivations for challenging Mrs. Barrett's current marriage, namely, your assessment of her as a better investment after your second marriage proved financially disappointing, demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of marriage itself. This court will not enable the treatment of women as commercial assets to be traded and transferred at men's convenience. Eliza felt tears of relief gathering in her eyes as she began to understand that justice would indeed prevail. Beside her, Colt's grip on her hand tightened, and she could see the tension beginning to leave his shoulders. The marriage between Colt Barrett and Eliza Thornton Barrett was performed legally and in good faith by both parties, Judge Morrison declared. Mrs. Barrett entered into that union after being abandoned by the petitioner, and the union has been consummated and has produced a genuine partnership that deserves legal protection. This court therefore denies Mr. Whitman's petition and affirms the validity of the Barrett marriage. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as friends and neighbors celebrated the victory of love and justice over opportunistic manipulation. Eliza found herself swept into Colt's arms, the prairie roses crushed between them as he held her close enough to whisper in her ear. "You're mine," he said fiercely, his voice rough with emotion. "Legally, officially, and forever. No one can take you away from me now." "And you're mine," she whispered back, tears of joy streaming down her face. "My husband, my partner, my love, always and completely." For the first time since their wedding 3 months ago, Colt kissed her with the passion of a man claiming the woman he loved rather than the formal politeness of a business arrangement. The kiss was witnessed by the entire community, a public declaration that their marriage had become something far more meaningful than either of them had originally intended. When they finally broke apart, Eliza saw that Thomas Whitman was already pushing his way toward the courthouse exit, his face dark with anger and humiliation. His lawyer followed, muttering about appeals and procedural challenges. But Judge Morrison's decision had been so definitive, and his reasoning so sound that any further legal action would be both expensive and futile. Sally Whitman approached them as the crowd began to disperse, her face bright with satisfaction at having played a crucial role in securing justice. "I'm so happy for you both," she said warmly. "You deserve every bit of happiness you can find together." "What will you do now?" Eliza asked, concerned for the young woman who had shown such courage in testifying against her own husband. "I'm returning to my family in Ohio," Sally replied. "My marriage to Thomas was based on deception from the beginning, so it can be annulled without difficulty. I'll be fine. I'm stronger than I look. And I've learned valuable lessons about the kind of man I should avoid in the future." As they made their way out of the courthouse, Eliza was struck by the number of people who stopped to offer congratulations and express their pleasure at the outcome. Mrs. Chon embraced her tearfully, declaring that justice had been served and love had triumphed. Tom Hendricks and the other ranch hands gathered around Colt, shaking his hand and slapping his back in the way of men who had witnessed their boss fight for something that mattered. Even Silas Hutchinson appeared, having made his first trip to town in years, specifically to attend the hearing. "Glad to see things worked out proper," he said gruffly, shaking Colt's hand with genuine warmth. "You're a lucky man, Barrett. Don't forget to treasure what you've got." "I won't," Colt replied solemnly. "Not for a single day." The ride back to the ranch passed in a haze of joy and relief, with Eliza's head resting on Colt's shoulder as they watched their land spread out before them under the pale November sky. The cottonwoods were bare now, their branches etched against the clouds like delicate lacework. But the prairie grass still held traces of gold that caught the afternoon light. "What are you thinking about?" Colt asked as they turned into the familiar lane that led to their home. "How different everything looks now," she replied thoughtfully. 3 months ago, I saw this land as refuge from desperation. Now it looks like home, like the place where we'll build our life together." "Our life together," he repeated, as if testing the words for their weight and meaning. "I like the sound of that, Mrs. Barrett." That evening, as they sat before the fireplace in their parlor, Eliza reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The prairie roses Colt had picked for her that morning were arranged in a simple vase on the mantelpiece, their sweet fragrance mingling with the wood smoke and creating an atmosphere of domestic peace. "I have something for you," Colt said, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a small wrapped package. "Something I've been working on during the evenings when you thought I was just reading." Inside the tissue paper was a delicate silver hair comb, its surface engraved with the same wildflower pattern that decorated Sarah's locket. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but clearly amateur, the work of loving hands rather than professional skill. "You made this?" she asked, touched by the thought and effort such a gift represented. "Seemed like you should have something that was." "Made specially for you," he said, his cheeks slightly flushed with embarrassment. "I know it's not as fine as store-bought jewelry." But she silenced him with a kiss that conveyed all the love and gratitude that words could not adequately express. When they parted, she turned so he could fasten the comb in her hair, the silver catching the firelight and making her feel more beautiful than any expensive ornament could have managed. "It's perfect," she said simply. "The most beautiful gift I've ever received, because it came from your hands and your heart." As they settled back into comfortable conversation about their plans for the ranch and their hopes for the future, Eliza marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. She had come to Kansas seeking security through marriage to a stranger. She had found love, purpose, and belonging beyond anything she had dared to imagine. The freshly picked prairie roses on the mantelpiece would wilt and fade within a few days, but they would always represent this perfect moment when love triumphed over opportunism, and two wounded hearts discovered that healing was possible when approached with patience, wisdom, and genuine care for each other's happiness. The silver hair comb caught the spring sunlight streaming through the bedroom window as Eliza arranged her auburn hair for the journey to town. 6 months had passed since Judge Morrison's decisive ruling. 6 months of deepening love and growing partnership that had transformed their marriage of convenience into something that exceeded both their wildest hopes. Today marked a special occasion, the Sedgwick County Fair, where she would enter her apple pie in competition for the first time, carrying on a tradition that Sarah Barrett had established years before. The comb Colt had crafted for her during those anxious evenings before the hearing had become her most treasured possession, worn for every special occasion as a reminder of the man who had learned to express his love through both words and actions. Its weight in her hair felt like a blessing, a tangible symbol of the transformation that had overtaken their relationship since that day in court when he had stood before the entire community and claimed her as his wife in every sense that mattered. "Are you ready for this?" Colt asked from the doorway, his own appearance reflecting the care he had taken in preparing for their first public social event since their marriage had been legally confirmed. The well-tailored suit emphasized his broad shoulders and confident bearing, but it was the warmth in his pale blue eyes when he looked at her that made her heart race with the same excitement she had felt as a young girl anticipating her first dance. "More than ready," she replied, adjusting the blue ribbon in her hair, not the same one that Sarah had won, but a new one that represented her own hopes and ambitions. "Mrs. Chun assures me that the secret ingredient you shared with me will give us an excellent chance of success." The apple pie that waited in the kitchen represented more than culinary ambition. It was a symbol of how completely she had been accepted into the Barrett family legacy. When Colt had shared Sarah's secret recipe, the touch of cinnamon in the crust that had made her pies legendary throughout the territory, he had been offering Eliza a place in the continuing story of their home, rather than asking her to compete with memory. "Sarah would be pleased to know her recipe is being put to good use again," he said, crossing the room to slip his arms around her waist from behind. "She always said that the best recipes were meant to be shared, not hoarded like family secrets." The easy way he spoke of his first wife now, without the defensive pain that had characterized his earlier references to her, demonstrated how completely he had healed from his grief. Love for Eliza had not diminished his memories of Sarah. Instead, it had restored his ability to remember the good times without being overwhelmed by loss. "I hope I can do justice to her reputation," Eliza said, leaning back against his solid warmth and marveling at how natural such intimacy had become between them. "You'll do more than that," Colt replied confidently. "You'll create your own reputation, just as you've created your own place in this community. Sarah's legacy lives on through the kindness and wisdom she shared, but you're not competing with her memory. You're adding to the story of what the Barrett name means to people around here." The insight revealed how much thought he had given to the complex dynamics of honoring the past while building toward the future. Their marriage had become a testament to the possibility of loving deeply more than once, of building new happiness on the foundation of lessons learned through loss and healing. The drive to the county fairgrounds took them through countryside that was lush with early summer growth, the prairie grass green and thick after a wet spring that had blessed the entire territory with abundant rainfall. Cattle grazed contentedly in pastures that stretched to the horizon, and the sky overhead was the kind of brilliant blue that seemed to promise infinite possibilities for joy and celebration. That other wagons and buggies converged on the fairgrounds. From all directions, their occupants dressed in their finest clothes and carrying the fruits of months of preparation, prized livestock, carefully preserved vegetables, quilts, and needlework that represented the domestic arts that bound frontier communities together. The annual fair was more than entertainment. It was a celebration of survival, prosperity, and the human connections that made life meaningful even in harsh and isolated circumstances. "There's Silas," Colt observed, pointing toward a wagon where their formerly reclusive neighbor was carefully unloading a magnificent chestnut marais that had clearly been groomed and trained for competition. "I still can't quite believe he's participating again after all these years." Silas Hutchinson had indeed returned to community life with enthusiasm that surprised everyone who remembered his years of bitter isolation. His friendship with Eliza had grown steadily since that first diplomatic visit, and he had become one of their most frequent dinner guests. His stories of the territory's early days providing entertainment for winter evenings when ranch work was light. "People need to feel valued and welcome," Eliza replied, watching as Martha Hutchinson and her children gathered around their grandfather, with obvious pride in his decision to rejoin the social fabric of their community. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to extend a genuine invitation." The philosophy had guided many of her efforts over the past months, as she had gradually assumed a leadership role in various community organizations. Her success in bringing Silas back into social circulation had led to requests for help with other isolated or struggling families, and she had discovered a talent for the kind of patient diplomacy that could heal long-standing rifts and encourage participation in community life. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity as families set up displays and prepared for the various competitions that would determine prizes in categories ranging from livestock to preserves to handcrafts. Eliza carried her apple pie to the judging tent with the kind of nervous excitement she had not felt since childhood, acutely aware that this represented her first public test as the new Mrs. Barrett. "Good luck, dear," said Margaret Henderson, the pastor's wife, as she arranged her own entry in the baked goods competition. "Though from what I hear about your cooking skills, the rest of us should probably be wishing ourselves luck instead." The friendly rivalry was exactly what Eliza had hoped for, acceptance as a peer and competitor rather than deference to her position as Colt Barrett's wife. She had worked hard to earn respect based on her own merits, and the casual confidence with which other women treated her suggested that she had succeeded in establishing herself as a valued member of their community. The day passed in a whirl of activities that reminded Eliza why Sarah had loved the county fair so much. There were horse races that drew crowds of cheering spectators, livestock competitions that showcased the finest breeding stock in the territory, and demonstrations of skills ranging from roping to quilting to marksmanship. The Barrett ranch hands acquitted themselves well in various contests, with young Billy Mason taking second place in the bronc riding competition and Miguel Rodriguez winning the roping contest with an exhibition of skill that drew applause from experienced cowboys throughout the territory. But it was the dancing that evening that provided the most meaningful celebration of Eliza's transformation from desperate mail-order bride to beloved community member. As the fiddle music began and couples took their places for the traditional square dances that marked the fair's culmination, Colt led her onto the makeshift dance floor with the pride of a man showing off his greatest treasure. "I should warn you," he said as they took their positions for the first dance, "I'm somewhat out of practice. Sarah was the one who loved dancing. I just followed her lead and tried not to embarrass myself too badly." "Then tonight we'll both be learning together," Eliza replied, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "The best partnerships are built on mutual willingness to try new things." The dance began slowly, with simple steps that allowed them to find their rhythm together. But as the music grew more spirited, and the other couples around them laughed and swirled with increasing enthusiasm, Eliza found herself swept up in the pure joy of physical expression and community celebration. Colt proved to be a better dancer than his modest disclaimers had suggested, leading her through the intricate patterns with growing confidence and obvious pleasure. "You're beautiful," he said during a brief pause between dances, his voice slightly breathless from exertion, but warm with admiration. "Not just tonight, but always. I want you to know how grateful I am for every day we have together. Even when I burn the biscuits or argue with you about cattle purchases." She teased, her own happiness making her feel giddy and playful. "Especially then," he replied seriously. "Perfect people are boring, Eliza. I love you because you're real, because you challenge me and surprise me, and make me want to be better than I thought I could be." The second dance was a waltz, slower and more intimate than the square dances, allowing them to move together in a kind of harmony that reflected their growing partnership in all aspects of life. As they turned slowly under the lantern light, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become like family, Eliza reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. "Mrs. Barrett," called out the fair announcer as the music came to an end, "would you please come forward to receive your award?" The blue ribbon for first place in the apple pie competition felt surprisingly heavy in her hands as she accepted it, with the cheers and applause of the entire community ringing in her ears. But it was the expression of pride and love on Colt's face that made the moment truly meaningful, not because she had won a competition, but because she had proven herself worthy of carrying on traditions that mattered to him and to their shared community. "Sarah would be so proud," he said as they drove home under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. "Not just of the blue ribbon, but of everything you've accomplished here. You've honored her memory while creating your own legacy." The silver hair comb caught starlight as Eliza leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the perfect rightness of this life they had built together from the unpromising materials of necessity and mutual convenience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to strengthen their partnership, but tonight was for celebration and gratitude for the unexpected blessing of finding true love, when they had both given up hope of such happiness. The prairie stretched around them in all directions, vast and eternal, under the summer sky, holding within its embrace all the promise of seasons yet to come. Like the hardy grass that bent before fierce winds but never broke, their love had proven strong enough to weather any storm that might arise. Rooted deep in respect and nurtured by daily acts of kindness and consideration, as they approached the lights of home, their home. Built on the foundation of trust and mutual care, Eliza touched the silver comb in her hair and smiled at the memory of desperate words spoken in this same kitchen 6 months ago. "Please marry me, sir. I'm all alone." Tonight she was anything but alone, surrounded by love and belonging, and the absolute certainty that some of life's most beautiful stories began with the courage to ask for help when it was needed most.